My son's wealthy in-laws always looked at me like I was dirt on their shoes. On the way to their elite anniversary gala, I stopped to pull a dying 10-year-old girl from a burning wreck. When I arrived late and covered in blood, they had me thrown out by security like a piece of garbage. They had no idea the little girl I saved belonged to the one billionaire who held their entire bankrupt empire in the palm of her hand. My name is Vaughn Hayes, and I am 69 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. I was gripping the worn steering wheel of my Chevy, the engine humming a tired tune as I navigated the slick streets of downtown Atlanta. I was already feeling out of place. I wore a cheap rented tuxedo that pinched my shoulders heading to the Waldorf Astoria for my son Devin's in-laws Pierce and Meredith Kensington. They were celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary. To them, I was just Devin's aging blue-collar father, a man who lived in a small brick house on the south side and fixed antique radios to pass the time. They tolerated me only when absolutely necessary, and tonight was one of those rare obligations. I was rehearsing my polite, invisible smile when the world in front of me erupted. The sound was deafening, a metallic crunch of tearing steel and shattering glass. 2 cars ahead, a massive delivery truck had blown a tire, swerving violently across 2 lanes. A sleek black SUV trying to avoid it slammed into the concrete divider at full speed. The impact launched the SUV into the air, flipping it entirely before it crashed down on its roof with a sickening thud. Smoke immediately hissed from the crushed hood, quickly thickening into a dark cloud. Cars around me slammed on their brakes, tires screeching. People froze in their seats, staring in shock, waiting for someone else to move. I did not wait. I slammed my car into park right in the middle of the road, kicked my door open, and ran toward the mangled wreck. Flames were starting to lick the edges of the crushed engine block. The driver's side was completely caved in, the airbags deflated like torn sails. I ran to the back passenger door, pulling the handle with all my strength. It was jammed shut, the metal frame warped from the roll. Through the shattered window I saw her. A little girl no older than 10 hanging upside down from her seatbelt. She was not crying. She was convulsing violently. Her eyes rolled back, foam and blood bubbling at the corner of her mouth. Her head had struck the window frame and a deep laceration was pouring blood down the side of her face. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when someone is dying. I learned that 4 decades ago in the jungles of Vietnam. I served as a combat medic patching up young men while mortar fire shook the earth beneath our boots. I spent my youth holding compressed gauze to chest wounds and clearing airways in the dark. That muscle memory never truly leaves you. It simply sleeps, waiting for the moment it is needed again. I found a heavy piece of debris on the asphalt, gripped it tight, and smashed the remaining shards of the passenger window. I reached in, ignoring the jagged glass biting into my forearms. I supported the little girl's neck with one hand to stabilize her cervical spine, clicked the seatbelt release with the other, and caught her weight as she dropped. I pulled her out of the wreckage just as the front cabin caught fire. I laid her flat on the cold, wet asphalt away from the flames. Her seizures were worsening. Her airway was compromised by the blood and fluids pooling in her mouth. I quickly rolled her onto her side into the recovery position, using my fingers to clear her airway so she would not choke. She was bleeding heavily from the head wound. Without a second thought, I ripped off my rented tuxedo jacket and pressed the clean white fabric of my shirt against her temple, applying hard, steady pressure to stop the arterial flow. Warm crimson soaked through my shirt, staining my hands and cuffs. I held her steady, murmuring calm, rhythmic words, shielding her small body while the fire raged behind us. I did not care about the gala. I did not care about my suit. I just focused on the steady beat of her pulse under my stained fingers. The wail of sirens finally pierced the chaotic noise of the street. An ambulance and 2 fire trucks skidded onto the scene, their red and blue lights painting the wet road. Paramedics rushed over with their trauma kits. I gave them a rapid clinical handoff detailing her convulsion duration, the nature of the head wound, and her pulse rate. They looked at me with brief surprise at my precision before taking over, loading the little girl onto a stretcher and securing her with a neck brace. The police cordoned off the area, and a young officer pulled me aside to take my statement. I gave him the details of the crash, the delivery truck swerving, the exact sequence of events. He jotted down my information, looked at my blood-soaked clothes, and told me I was free to go. He thanked me, calling me a hero. I did not feel like a hero. I felt old, my bones aching from the sudden burst of adrenaline. The cool night air hit my wet, ruined shirt, making me shiver. I walked back to my Chevy, sitting in the driver's seat for a long moment just to steady my trembling hands. I looked at the dashboard clock. I was exhausted, my knuckles scraped and bleeding, and I was exactly an hour late for the Kensington Anniversary Gala. I wiped my hands on an old rag from the glove compartment, took a deep breath, and put the car in drive. I pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Waldorf Astoria. The valet looked at my beat-up Chevy like a roach that had crawled onto a wedding cake. He hesitated to even take the keys until I handed them over with a firm, silent nod. I stepped out into the blinding crystalline lights of the hotel exterior. The contrast was dizzying. Valets rushed around opening doors for women in designer gowns and men in bespoke suits. And then there was me. I walked through the towering glass revolving doors into the grand lobby. The air inside smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted duck. The smooth jazz of a live band drifted from the grand ballroom down the hall. I caught my reflection in a mirrored pillar. I was a sight. I had put my tuxedo jacket back on, but it could not hide the massive dark red bloodstain blooming across the entire front of my white shirt. My hands were visibly coated in dried brown blood, and a smudge of ash streaked across my forehead. The lively chatter in the lobby began to die down as I walked across the pristine marble floor. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. I saw women clutch their pearls and men take defensive steps back. I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of 100 wealthy eyes staring at me with utter, undisguised disgust. They saw a monster, a vagrant, a threat to their perfect evening. I kept my chin up, scanning the room for my son, hoping Devin would see me and understand. Instead, I saw my daughter-in-law, Courtney, and the look of sheer revulsion on her face told me this night was about to get much worse. I watched Courtney's perfectly sculpted face twist into a mask of pure repulsion. She grabbed my son by the arm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket, and yanked him behind a towering arrangement of white orchids. Her frantic whispers carried across the polished marble. It was an ugly sound, sharp and panicked, like a snake cornered in a pristine garden. A few yards away, her parents, Pierce and Meredith Kensington, finally noticed the commotion. Pierce stood tall, a silver-haired patriarch holding a flute of champagne, radiating the kind of old-money arrogance that demanded total submission. Beside him, Meredith was draped in diamonds that caught the chandelier light. The moment her eyes landed on my blood-soaked shirt, she literally recoiled. She slapped a hand over her mouth, letting out a dramatic gasp as if I had just tracked raw sewage into her private sanctuary. She took 2 steps backward, shielding her designer gown from my mere presence. Pierce's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, scanning me from head to toe with absolute disdain. He did not see a man who had just experienced a trauma. He did not see his son-in-law's father. He saw a stain, a filthy, unacceptable flaw in his carefully curated evening. Guests parted like the Red Sea, giving me a wide, isolating berth. I stood there feeling the damp chill of the blood on my skin, waiting for someone, anyone, to ask if I was hurt. Instead, Devin emerged from behind the orchids. His face was flushed, his jaw set. He marched toward me with hurried, aggressive steps, desperate to close the distance before I could take another step into the ballroom. Devin stopped inches from my face, his body rigid to block anyone else from getting too close. I looked at the boy I had raised, the son I had worked 3 jobs to put through an Ivy League school without a single dime of debt. I expected to see concern in his eyes. I expected the immediate panic a child feels when they see their father covered in blood. But there was no panic for my well-being. There was only rage. Devin. I started keeping my voice steady despite the exhaustion settling into my bones. There was a terrible accident on the highway. A truck blew a tire. I had to pull a little girl out of a burning car. I expected him to soften, to exhale in relief that I was safe. Instead, his eyes darted nervously around the lobby, checking to see who was watching. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper. "Are you out of your mind? Look at yourself. You look like a butcher. You are embarrassing her family. Just get out." The words felt like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs, not from the exertion of the rescue, but from the crushing weight of his betrayal. I stared at him, searching his face for any trace of the boy who used to sit on my lap and listen to my stories. That boy was gone. He had been replaced by a man completely consumed by the desperate need to fit into a world that would never truly accept him. "Devin," I said, my voice dropping lower, slower. "A child almost died tonight. This blood belongs to a 10-year-old girl. I do not care. He snapped his face, contorting with impatient fury. This is the most important night of Pierce and Meredith's lives. They are waiting for investors to save their company. You are ruining everything. Just turn around, walk out those doors, and go back to your neighborhood. You do not belong here tonight. He chose them. In front of the entire glittering elite of the city, my own flesh and blood chose the shallow, fragile facade of his wealthy in-laws over his father. He chose the Kensingtons over the man who gave up his youth so his son could have a future. My heart did not break. It turned to ice. Before I could formulate a response, Pierce Kensington materialized beside Devon. He did not utter a single word to me. He did not ask what happened or offer a shred of basic human decency. He simply looked at me with cold, dead eyes and raised his right hand. He snapped his fingers twice. Instantly, 4 massive security guards in dark suits converged on me. They moved with aggressive, practiced efficiency. Before I could even raise my hands to defend myself, 2 of them grabbed my arms, twisting them painfully behind my back. The other 2 grabbed my shoulders, clamping down with crushing force. "Sir, you are trespassing." One of the guards barked loudly, ensuring the wealthy audience heard the justification. "I am on the guest list," I said firmly, but my words were swallowed by the commotion. They did not care. The guards manhandled me, lifting me almost entirely off the ground. They shoved me backward, forcing me through the grand revolving doors. I was paraded like a common criminal through the lobby, my blood-stained shirt serving as a spectacle for the horrified guests. They shoved me out into the biting night air. The largest guard shoved me hard against the chest, sending me stumbling backward until my shoes hit the edge of the cold concrete sidewalk. I caught my balance just before falling into the street. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, sealing me out in the cold. Most men would have screamed. Most men would have slammed their fists against the reinforced glass, cursed their son, or demanded justice from the indifferent security guards standing on the other side of the doors. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show them a single ounce of the pain tearing through my chest. 40 years ago, I learned that anger is useless unless it is focused. I stood on the damp sidewalk, bathed in the glow of the streetlights, and slowly adjusted the lapels of my ruined, blood-soaked tuxedo jacket. I smoothed the fabric with total icy silence, regaining my dignity in the face of their profound disrespect. I looked back through the glass. Pierce was patting Devon on the back, offering a proud, approving nod for getting rid of the trash. Courtney had returned to her husband's side, linking her arm through his, her perfect smile restored. They returned to their champagne and their fake laughter. I turned my back onto the Waldorf Astoria. I raised my hand and hailed a passing yellow cab. The driver gave my bloody shirt a wide-eyed look of alarm, but I handed him a crisp $50 bill before sitting down. "Take me to the south side," I told him quietly. The cab pulled away from the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. As we merged into traffic, I glanced out the rear window. Just as my taxi cleared the hotel entrance, a fleet of 6 bulletproof black SUVs screeched to a violent halt right where I had been standing. The imposing vehicles blocked the entire driveway, their dark-tinted windows gleaming under the hotel lights. Security guards scrambled out, moving with frantic urgency to open the doors. The VIP the Kensingtons had been waiting for all night had finally arrived, and she was about to turn their perfect evening into a living nightmare. The heavy armored doors of the lead SUV swung open before the vehicle even came to a complete halt. Security guards stepped out scanning the perimeter, but the person who emerged from the back seat did not wait for their cue. Victoria Thorne stepped onto the cold concrete. She was widely known as the most ruthless billionaire venture capitalist in the city, a woman whose mere presence commanded boardrooms and dictated market trends. She was the absolute lifeline the Kensingtons had been desperately clinging to, the sole investor capable of saving their sinking empire. But tonight, she looked nothing like the titan of industry featured on magazine covers. Her usually immaculate platinum blonde hair was a wind-blown, tangled mess. Her sharp, tailored blazer was heavily wrinkled, and she moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. She bypassed the valet stand completely, her designer heels clicking harshly against the pavement. Her eyes were swollen red and wild with a mixture of sheer terror and lingering adrenaline. She had just spent the last hour pacing the chaotic floor of a hospital trauma center, watching surgeons stabilize her 10-year-old daughter. She had held her child's soot-stained hand, listening to the paramedics recount how a stranger in a rented tuxedo had dragged the girl out of a burning car just seconds before the engine exploded. The police had given her a brief description of the man, and told her he headed toward this exact hotel. Victoria pushed through the grand revolving doors of the Waldorf Astoria. The lively, arrogant chatter of the elite guests immediately softened into a confused murmur. People expected a grand entrance, a confident stride, a prepared speech. Instead, they saw a billionaire mother on the verge of a total breakdown. She breathed heavily, her chest heaving as she frantically scanned the opulent lobby. The raw desperation radiating from her stopped the string quartet mid-note. Pierce Kensington spotted her from across the vast room. He immediately straightened his posture, plastering on a megawatt smile of pure sycophantic charm. He quickly shoved his champagne flute into the hands of a passing waiter and strode forward, exuding the false confidence of a man who firmly believed his ultimate financial salvation had just arrived. Meredith and Courtney followed closely behind him, their faces alight with greedy, undisguised anticipation. Devon trailed them, eager to prove his worth to his wealthy new family by standing shoulder to shoulder with their savior. "Victoria, my dear Victoria," Pierce boomed, his voice dripping with forced, sickening warmth. "We are so incredibly honored you could make it tonight. The gala was simply not complete without you. Please let us get you a drink and we can discuss the final details of the merger." He reached out to take her hands, aiming for a familiar aristocratic double kiss on the cheek. Victoria did not reciprocate. She stopped dead in her tracks, aggressively pulling away from his grasp. Her eyes darted away from his welcoming smile and locked instantly onto the polished marble floor. Right there, stark and undeniable against the pristine white stone, was a single smudged footprint of dried crimson. A trail of small, faint red droplets led directly from the center of the lobby to the front doors. She pointed a shaking finger at the floor, her breathing turning ragged. "Who was that?" she demanded, her voice cracking but carrying sharply across the suddenly silent lobby. Pierce paused, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he smoothly recovered his arrogant composure. He glanced down at the bloody footprint and let out a soft, dismissive chuckle, waving his hand as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "Oh, that," Pierce said smoothly. "I must apologize for the mess. We had a slight security issue a few moments ago. Just an old senile man who managed to slip past the front desk." Victoria stared at him, her eyes widening in horror. "A black man?" she asked, her voice tightening into a dangerous wire, wearing a ruined tuxedo. Pierce rolled his eyes, utterly oblivious to the massive storm brewing right in front of him. "Yes, exactly," he sneered. "A filthy, deranged gatecrasher covered in grime and blood. He clearly had no business being in a place like this. He was making a scene, disturbing our guests, so I had my security physically throw him out onto the street where he belongs. It is already taken care of." The sound of the slap rang out like a gunshot. It echoed violently against the high vaulted ceilings of the lobby, sharp and stinging. Pierce stumbled backward completely, stunned, a bright red handprint instantly blooming across his left cheek. Meredith shrieked in absolute horror, clutching her diamond necklace. Courtney gasped loudly, taking a frightened step back as if she had been physically struck herself. The entire lobby went dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. "That man," Victoria snarled, her voice shaking with a raw, primal fury, "just pulled my daughter out of a burning car. He saved my child's life while you stand here drinking champagne." The color drained entirely from Pierce's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His arrogant facade shattered into a million pieces. Victoria took an aggressive step closer, her eyes blazing with absolute, unadulterated contempt. "He bled for my daughter. He risked his own life. And you treated him like garbage. You threw him out on the street like an animal. You are absolute scum, Pierce. All of you." Pierce raised a trembling hand, desperately attempting to salvage the unsalvageable situation. "Victoria, please, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. We did not know. We still have the contracts to sign." Victoria let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through the silent room. "There will be no contracts. The $50 million merger is canceled immediately. I will never do business with people like you. I will personally see to it that Kensington Group goes bankrupt." She turned on her heel and walked fiercely out the door. Pierce looked like his legs were about to give out. Devon stood frozen behind his wife, his eyes wide with dawn terror. The realization of what he had just done to his own father paralyzed him. His fingers went entirely numb. The crystal champagne glass slipped from his grip, hitting the marble floor and shattering into 100 jagged pieces. Miles away from the glittering, shattered ruins of the Waldorf Astoria, the only sound in my small, dimly lit bathroom was the steady rush of running water. I stood over the porcelain sink, my sleeves rolled up to my elbows. The water swirling down the drain was tinted a faint rusty pink. I scrubbed my hands methodically with a rough bar of cheap soap washing away the last stubborn flakes of dried blood. I felt no lingering anger. I felt no profound sadness. I felt an absolute terrifying clarity. I dried my hands on a worn towel and walked slowly into my modest kitchen. The heavy silence of my brick house was a deep comfort, a stark and welcome contrast to the hollow, arrogant noise of the world I had just left behind. I poured myself a tall glass of cold water and sat at the small wooden table staring at the peeling wallpaper. Then the silence shattered. My cell phone resting face up on the kitchen counter began to vibrate violently against the formica surface. The screen lit up this dark room with a bright, persistent glow. It rang once, twice, 3 times frantic and undeniably desperate. I did not move from my chair to answer it. I simply watched the screen illuminate the shadows. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dark. Devin, my son, was calling. The boy who had just thrown me out onto the concrete like trash was now desperately trying to reach me, undoubtedly realizing the catastrophic, unfixable mistake he had just made. He wanted me to save him. He wanted me to fix the massive disaster he had willingly created. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, watching the phone ring until it finally went to voicemail. Then it immediately started ringing again. I smiled a cold, hard smile. The war had begun. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long gray shadows across my modest living room. It was exactly 7 in the morning. I was sitting in my favorite worn armchair, nursing a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The phone had finally stopped ringing around 3 in the morning, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. I knew they would come. It was never a matter of if, only a matter of how long it would take for their panic to turn into misdirected rage. The answer came with a violent, deafening crash. The front door of my brick house swung open so hard the heavy brass doorknob punched a jagged hole straight into the drywall. Devin stormed into the foyer, his face flushed a deep, angry red. His expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck, and his shirt was severely wrinkled. He looked exactly like a man who had not slept a single minute, a man whose entire fabricated reality was collapsing around him. Courtney was right behind him, her designer heels clicking frantically and aggressively against the hardwood floor. She was still wearing the same crumpled designer gown from the gala, her expensive makeup smeared darkly underneath her furious, bloodshot eyes. I did not stand up. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of surprise. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cold coffee and placed the ceramic mug gently on the wooden coaster. I expected a shred of remorse from my own flesh and blood. I expected my son to drop his gaze in shame for how he had treated me the night before, for watching security guards throw his father out like a stray dog. Instead, they radiated pure, unadulterated entitlement. They marched into my living room not as family seeking forgiveness, but as creditors demanding immediate payment for a debt I did not owe. Courtney's chest heaved as she pointed a manicured, accusing finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the fact that she had just kicked open my front door like a common criminal. "You ruined everything," Courtney shrieked at the top of her lungs. Her voice was shrill and desperate, cutting through the quiet morning air like a piece of shattered glass. "You completely destroyed my family. Because of your stupid, selfish stunt at the hotel Victoria Thorne pulled out of the corporate merger. My parents are facing total financial bankruptcy. We are going to lose the company, the mansion, the cars, everything." I looked at her flushed face, then shifted my calm gaze to Devin. He was standing directly over me, his hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists, his breathing heavy and erratic. "Do you have any idea what you did?" he demanded, stepping closer to my armchair, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me. "You humiliated us in front of the most important, powerful people in the city. You made us look like trash. And now Victoria thinks my in-laws are absolute monsters because of you." I sat perfectly still, letting his ridiculous, baseless accusations hang in the stale morning air. Because of me, I asked calmly, keeping my tone perfectly level despite the rage boiling in my veins. Because I bled on a marble floor after pulling a dying child from a burning car. Because you chose to stand there and watch while your father was violently thrown out onto the street by hired thugs. Courtney stepped forward, slamming her flat hand down on my wooden coffee table, rattling my mug. "Shut up about the kid," she snapped with a cruelty that was genuinely shocking. "This is about real money. This is about our entire future. You are going to fix this right now. You are going to pick up the phone, find a way to contact Victoria Thorne, and you are going to beg for her forgiveness. You will tell her it was a massive misunderstanding. You will tell her my parents are wonderful, charitable people, and you will convince her to sign that $50 million contract today." Devin closed the remaining distance, standing practically toe-to-toe with my chair, while I remained seated in absolute silence. He leaned down, his face twisted in desperate, selfish anger. "You owe me this, Dad," he hissed, his voice vibrating with absolute audacity. "You embarrassed me in front of my wife's family. You owe me this. Fix it. Fix it right now, or I swear I will never speak to you again." I stared at the grown man standing over me. The sweet, innocent boy I had raised was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of greed. I looked at the custom-tailored suit he wore, the expensive gold watch gleaming on his wrist, the polished leather shoes on his feet. I remembered the grueling years I spent working the night shift at the shipping yard, clocking out just in time to start my morning route driving a delivery truck, only to finish the grueling day, sweeping floors at an office building downtown. I worked 3 brutal, bone-crushing jobs for 10 straight years so Devin could walk out of his elite Ivy League university with a pristine degree and 0 debt. I shattered my back so he could have a bright future free of financial burden. I hid my own immense wealth from him, deeply wanting him to build strong character, wanting him to deeply understand the true value of a dollar earned through honest, back-breaking sweat. I wanted him to be a man of substance, a man who judged others by their actions and their integrity, not the brand of their clothing. The sheer blinding entitlement radiating from him snapped the final frayed thread of my paternal bond. There was no love left in his eyes today. There was only a ravenous, consuming greed and the pathetic desperation of a weak man who realized his free ride was coming to an abrupt end. I slowly stood up from my armchair, drawing myself up to my full height. Devin instinctively took a half-step back, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossing his face. I did not raise a hand. I did not yell or curse. My voice dropped a full octave, cold, resonant, and completely devoid of affection. "I owe you nothing." I spoke the words with deliberate, crushing finality. "Not a single thing in this world belongs to you by right. I paid for your life with my sweat and my sacrifice. I gave you every opportunity a father could give, and you repay me by acting like a coward who bows to the highest bidder, a man willing to sell his own father for a seat at a wealthy table. Get out of my house." Devin's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest, completely unable to process my absolute rejection. "You are going to regret this," he snarled, his voice thick with venom and panic. "I will make sure you die alone in this miserable dump. You are dead to me." Courtney grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the broken front door, throwing one last look of absolute disgust over her shoulder. The door slammed shut behind them, violently rattling the windows in their frames. The silence returned to my living room, heavy and absolute. I did not sit back down. I turned my back on the front door, walked straight down the narrow hallway and into my private study. I moved the heavy oak bookshelf aside, revealing the electronic keypad of the wall safe I had not opened in years. I punched in the combination. The heavy steel door clicked open. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, leaving the contents untouched for the moment. My stomach gave a low, hollow rumble, a mundane reminder that basic human needs persist even when your family completely shatters. I needed a clear head to execute my next moves, and a clear head required food. I put on a worn canvas jacket to hide the chill of the morning and drove to the local supermarket on the corner of Elm Street. I walked through the fluorescent-lit aisles with a red plastic basket, picking up a loaf of wheat bread, a carton of eggs, and a bag of dark roast coffee. It was a simple, grounding routine, a way to anchor myself to reality. The cashier, a kind, middle-aged woman named Maria, who always made a point to ask about my day, rang up my meager items. I pulled my worn leather wallet from my back pocket and handed her my standard debit card. She swiped it through the machine. The terminal beeped a sharp, unpleasant tone. Declined. Maria offered a sympathetic, apologetic smile, gently suggesting I might have inserted the chip at the wrong angle. I wiped the magnetic strip and tried the reader a second time. Another harsh beep echoed at the register. Declined. A businessman standing behind me in line sighed heavily, shifting his weight in obvious irritation. Maria leaned in across the counter, her voice dropping to a soft, pitying whisper, telling me she could set the groceries aside if I needed to run to the bank to sort out my funds. The look of profound pity in her eyes stung my pride, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I stepped out of the line, apologizing for the delay. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket, tapping the screen to open my mobile banking application. I knew exactly how much money was supposed to be in that account. It was the joint checking account I shared with my son. The screen loaded slowly, eventually displaying my financial summary in stark, undeniable digital ink. My checking balance read $0.00. I stared at the glowing screen, my eyes meticulously tracing the transaction history to ensure I was not misreading the numbers due to exhaustion. A single massive transfer had been executed barely 2 hours ago, perfectly aligning with the time Devin and Courtney had stormed out of my living room. $15,000. Every single penny of my accumulated pension that I kept in that specific joint account to occasionally help Devin with his sudden household expenses had been completely drained. I clicked on the transaction details to expand the menu. Devin had officially authorized the withdrawal, but it was the note attached to the bank transfer that made my blood run absolutely ice cold. In the memo line, he had typed a specific legal banking code accompanied by a short, chilling sentence. Emergency transfer to prevent elder financial confusion and secure family assets. My own son had weaponized the banking system against me. He had utilized a specialized legal clause designed to protect vulnerable aging adults from predatory scammers, twisting it into a jagged knife to stab his own father in the back. The sheer calculated malice of the move was breathtaking in its cruelty. They were not just angry about the ruined Gala, they were highly methodical. They knew I lived a very modest life in a small brick house. They assumed that the $15,000 represented the absolute entirety of my life savings. By freezing me out of my only visible source of capital, they firmly believed they were cutting off my oxygen supply. This was a deliberate, coordinated siege tactic. Devin and his wealthy, arrogant in-laws were actively trying to starve me into total submission. They wanted me destitute, hungry, and terrified. They fully expected me to panic. They expected me to crawl back to them on my hands and knees, begging for access to my own pension money just so I could buy my next meal. They wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would have absolutely no choice but to pick up the phone, call Victoria Thorne, and grovel on their behalf to save the Kensington Empire from total collapse. They wanted to strip me of my dignity, forcing me to choose between my pride and my basic survival. It was a textbook corporate hostile takeover tactic brutally applied to a father by his own son. Devin had truly absorbed the worst, most parasitic traits of the Kensington family, prioritizing leverage and extortion over blood and loyalty. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner, leaving me entirely at their mercy. Most parents would have broken down right there in the brightly lit grocery store aisle. Most fathers would have felt the crushing, suffocating weight of total betrayal and wept at the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of their own child. I did not shed a single tear. I locked my phone screen and slipped the device back into my jacket pocket. Slowly, a smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy, warmth, or amusement. It was a terrifying, cold, and predatory smile. It was the smile of a man who suddenly realizes the enemy has vastly underestimated his artillery and has blindly marched straight into a heavily mined battlefield. Devin thought he had just delivered a fatal, crippling blow to a helpless old man. He had no idea he had simply fired a paper pellet at a heavily armored tank. I walked back to the register, politely told Maria I would not be needing the groceries today, and stepped out into the crisp, biting morning air. I did not get back into my Chevy. I knew that if they were tracking my bank accounts, they might also try to track my mobile phone location to see where I went in my presumed state of desperation. I left my smartphone locked securely inside the glove compartment of my car. I walked 3 blocks down the busy street, my strides long and deeply purposeful, until I found an outdated graffiti-covered payphone outside a rundown brick laundromat. I dropped a handful of silver quarters into the rusty slot, listening to the heavy metallic clink as they registered. I did not need to look up the phone number in any directory. I had memorized it years ago, keeping it locked away in my mind for an absolute catastrophic emergency. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver, put it to my ear, and dialed the secure, unlisted direct line. The line rang exactly twice before a sharp, hyper-focused voice answered. The man on the other end did not offer a polite greeting or state his name. He did not need to. Alejandro Vargas was a ruthless financial attorney, an apex corporate shark who specialized in obliterating companies and hiding generational wealth behind impenetrable walls of legal steel. He was the kind of lawyer billionaires called when they needed to quietly destroy their rivals without leaving a single fingerprint behind. He was also the fiercely loyal executor of my deepest, most closely guarded secret. Alejandro spoke into the receiver, my voice steady and echoing with absolute unwavering conviction. It is Vaughn. There was a brief, loaded pause on the line. The tone of the attorney shifted instantly from aggressive professional to highly attentive and respectful. Vaughn Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a serious, guarded register. It has been a long time. I was beginning to think you would never actually call this number. Are you in trouble? I looked down the gray street, watching the city traffic move in a blur of morning commuters. The betrayal of my son stung deep in my chest, but the clarity of my purpose was absolute. I am not in trouble, Alejandro, I replied, my grip tightening on the phone receiver. But a certain family is about to be. They have crossed a line and they firmly believe they have left me with absolutely nothing. I need you to initiate the primary protocol we discussed years ago. I heard the soft, rapid click of a high-end keyboard in the background. What are your exact orders, Vaughn? I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the massive weight of the moment settle over my shoulders. It is time to unlock Camille's trust fund. Less than an hour later, I was sitting in a leather chair that cost more than my first car, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, sunlit city skyline. Alejandro Vargas operated out of a penthouse suite encased in frosted glass and brushed steel. It was a sterile, highly secure environment designed specifically for men who moved millions of dollars with a single, untraceable keystroke. Alejandro sat across from me behind a massive obsidian desk. He was a sharp-featured man in a bespoke navy suit, his dark eyes studying me with calculated predatory intensity. He tapped a command on his tablet and the heavy privacy blinds automatically lowered, completely sealing us off from the rest of his elite firm. He poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch, sliding one across the polished stone surface toward me. I did not touch the drink. My mind was anchored firmly to the past, to the brilliant, beautiful woman who had made this level of unimaginable power possible. My late wife Camille was not just the love of my life. She was a visionary biochemist with an intellect that intimidated her peers. Decades ago, working grueling late nights in a cramped, underfunded university laboratory, she synthesized a highly specific protein compound that revolutionized cellular regeneration treatments. When the global pharmaceutical giants realized exactly what she had created, they engaged in a brutal, cutthroat bidding war for her exclusive patents. Camille secured a royalty structure that generated a massive tidal wave of passive income, a staggering fortune that flowed directly into an ironclad trust fund. When she passed away from a sudden illness, she left me as the sole controller of that vast financial empire. But I never touched a single cent of it. I kept my grueling blue-collar job. I bought my modest brick house. I drove my beat-up Chevy. I did it because I looked at the wealthy, spoiled children of the city's elite and saw nothing but moral rot. I deeply wanted Devon to understand the quiet dignity of hard labor. I wanted him to build his own legacy uncorrupted by the toxic safety net of endless wealth. I hid the money to save his soul. Today I realized my efforts had failed completely. Alejandro pressed a silver button on his desk console and a large flat-screen monitor embedded in the mahogany wall hummed to life. The screen instantly populated with complex financial charts cascading corporate spreadsheets and stark red graphs that pointed drastically downward. He did not waste time with pleasantries or condolences. He knew I preferred raw, unvarnished data over fake sympathy. You asked me to keep a silent watch on the Kensington Group when Devon married into their family, Alejandro said, his voice crisp and strictly professional. I have been meticulously tracking their quarterly filings, their various shell companies, and their offshore holdings for the past 3 years. The image of invincibility they project to the world is a complete, utter fabrication, Vaughn. They are not wealthy. They are a rapidly sinking ship, desperately bailing water to delay the inevitable collapse. I leaned forward, studying the bleeding red numbers illuminating the dark office. Explain the full picture to me, I instructed quietly. Alejandro brought up a detailed pie chart that looked like a corporate financial autopsy. Pierce Kensington is an arrogant fool who severely over-leveraged his commercial real estate portfolio. Alejandro explained, tapping the screen to highlight specific doomed properties. He took out massive high-interest commercial loans to build luxury developments that completely stalled due to zoning violations and catastrophic mismanagement. Right now, the Kensington Group is drowning in exactly $120 million of highly toxic, unrecoverable debt. They are burning through their last remaining cash reserves just to keep up appearances, paying for extravagant galas and designer wardrobes to trick the market into thinking they are still solvent. I looked at the massive debt figure, the intricate pieces of the puzzle rapidly clicking into place in my mind. The anniversary gala last night was not a celebration of love. It was a desperate theatrical performance to secure funding. Alejandro nodded in agreement, bringing up a new profile on the glowing screen. The commanding face of Victoria Thorne appeared. Yes, Alejandro confirmed. And this is the woman holding the heavy rope around their necks. Victoria Thorne and her venture capital firm Thorne Capital specialize in acquiring distressed assets. Over the past 8 months, Thorne Capital has aggressively bought up the Kensington Group's bad loans from multiple panicked banks. Victoria Thorne personally controls 60% of their total debt. If she calls in those loans, the Kensingtons will be legally forced into immediate bankruptcy. They will lose their company, their mansion, and every single asset they possess. They needed her signature on a restructuring deal last night just to survive the week. I sat back in my chair, the profound irony of the situation washing over me. I had pulled Victoria Thorne's daughter from a burning vehicle. Because of my blood on their pristine floor, Pierce had humiliated me, and in doing so, he had deeply insulted the one woman who literally owned his entire existence. The satisfying geometry of their impending corporate ruin was perfectly clear, but Alejandro was not finished. His professional demeanor shifted slightly, a rare shadow of genuine hesitation crossing his sharp features. He closed the digital presentation and reached into a locked drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thin, physical manila folder and placed it squarely between us. There is a secondary matter, Vaughn, Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a graver, much more cautious register. While my team was auditing their financial ties, they flagged a glaring anomaly within your personal public records. A document was filed with the county clerk just 3 weeks ago. I slowly opened the heavy paper folder. Inside was a standard bank loan agreement, officially stamped and notarized by the state. I read the bold print at the top of the page. It was a second mortgage heavily borrowing against the equity of my small brick house. I looked down at the signature line. There, written in blue ink, was a clumsy, heavily forced replication of my own handwriting. Right beside it, acting as the secondary guarantor, was Devon's unmistakable signature. My own son had completely forged my name. He had illegally leveraged the absolute only home I owned, risking my basic shelter and independence to extract a lump sum of cash. Why, I asked, my voice barely a whisper, processing the sheer magnitude of the crime. Alejandro handed me a corresponding bank statement highlighting the deposits. To cover the massive shortfall in Courtney's luxury lifestyle, he explained flatly. The cash extracted from your house paid for her recent trip to Milan, a pair of diamond earrings, and 3 months of lease payments on her sports car. Devon committed federal wire fraud and blatant forgery just to maintain the pathetic illusion that he could afford his wife. Most fathers would shatter into a million pieces at the sight of that forged signature. They would weep at the undeniable proof that their own flesh and blood valued a designer handbag over their father's basic security. I stared at the blue ink, feeling the last remaining fragment of my paternal mercy turn into absolute, unforgiving ash. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or curse my son's name to the heavens. I calmly closed the manila folder, perfectly aligning its edges with the corner of Alejandro's obsidian desk. The deep pain of the betrayal was completely eclipsed by the icy mechanical precision of what needed to be done next. I looked up at Alejandro. His dark eyes locked onto mine, waiting silently for the command. He knew better than to offer sympathy. He only offered brutal, effective solutions. I want you to weaponize Camille's trust, I instructed, my voice ringing with lethal authority. I want you to engage your proxy firms and deploy the capital immediately. Contact the secondary banks holding the remaining 40% of the Kensington Group's debt. Buy all of it at a premium. Buy their outstanding supplier invoices. Buy the mortgage on Pierce's mansion. I want to own every single financial obligation that bears the Kensington name. Alejandro's lips curled into a predatory, satisfied smile. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him, uncapping a heavy silver fountain pen. A silent, hostile takeover. Alejandro confirmed, his pen hovering over the blank page. We will suffocate them from all sides. By the time they realize who actually holds their paper, the net will already be completely closed around them. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my worn canvas jacket. Devin and his new family wanted to treat me like a disposable nuisance. They wanted to steal my home and starve me into submission. They were about to learn that they had declared war on an invisible empire. Execute the acquisition, Alejandro Thurster said, turning toward the heavy glass doors of the penthouse. Defense is over. Offense begins today. I left Alejandro's fortress of frosted glass and polished steel and stepped back onto the bustling city streets. The cold morning wind bit harshly at my face, but a fierce, newly awakened heat burned deep in my chest. The heavy gears of financial ruin were already turning in the background, but before I could fully commit my focus to destroying the Kensingtons, I needed to check on the one innocent soul caught in the crossfire of this nightmare. I hailed a passing cab and gave the driver the address for the city's premier pediatric trauma center. The hospital was a sprawling, sterile labyrinth of bright white corridors and glaring fluorescent lights. The air smelled sharply of harsh antiseptic and quiet, lingering desperation. I navigated the busy main floor, ignoring the weary glances of exhausted families, and rode the elevator up to the exclusive pediatric intensive care unit on the top floor. As the heavy metal doors slid open, two massive private security contractors in dark, tailored suits immediately blocked my path. They stood like impenetrable stone sentinels, their hands resting near their earpieces, fully prepared to physically remove anyone who did not belong on that floor. I did not wear a bespoke suit or carry an elite corporate badge. I wore my worn canvas jacket, faded denim, and sensible work boots. I approached the imposing desk calmly and stated my name, Vaughn Hayes. The head of security checked an electronic tablet resting on the counter. His aggressive defensive posture instantly vanished. The stern, intimidating lines of his face softened into an expression of absolute, genuine respect. He immediately stepped aside, holding his arm out to clear a path toward the private rooms. Miss Thorne left strict, explicit orders that you are to be granted immediate and unrestricted access. Mr. Hayes, please go right ahead. I walked past the heavy security checkpoint, feeling the intense gaze of the guards follow me. They were no longer looking at a suspected vagrant, but a man explicitly recognized and protected by the most powerful woman in the building. I found Victoria Thorne sitting at a small, polished table in a quiet, secluded alcove near the recovery rooms. The frantic, unraveled mother I had witnessed screaming in the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria was gone. In her place sat a woman composed and fiercely guarded, though the dark, bruising circles beneath her eyes betrayed a completely sleepless night. When she saw me approaching the alcove, she immediately stood up. She did not extend a hand for a polite, sterile corporate handshake. She stepped forward quickly and gripped both of my hands in hers. Her grip was tight and shaking with profound, unfiltered emotion. The sheer reverence in her posture was something all the wealth in the world could never buy. "Lily is stable," Victoria said, her voice thick with a heavy gratitude that seemed to echo from the deepest part of her soul. "She is resting comfortably. The trauma doctor said if you had waited even 30 seconds longer to clear her airway and stabilize her neck, the smoke and internal bleeding would have suffocated her before the fire ever reached the cabin. You gave me my daughter back. You gave me my entire life back." I offered a gentle, reassuring nod, feeling the lingering ache in my scraped knuckles. "That old muscle memory never truly fades away," I replied softly. "I am just intensely glad I was on that exact road at that exact moment." Victoria released my hands and gestured for me to sit across from her at the small table. She sat down, reaching into the inner pocket of her immaculate designer blazer. She pulled out a sleek, leather-bound checkbook and a heavy gold fountain pen. She opened the book, signed her elegant, authoritative signature at the bottom of a blank check, and ripped it smoothly from the binding. She slid the crisp piece of paper across the polished surface of the table until it rested directly in front of me. The amount line was completely blank. "I want you to fill in the number," Victoria stated, her tone shifting into a space of absolute, unshakable certainty. "Any number you want. Write it down right now, and it will clear my bank before the end of the day. Buy a sprawling mansion. Buy a private island. Pay off every single debt you or your family has ever owed. It does not matter to me. There is no conceivable monetary value I can place on my child's life, but this is a start. I ask absolutely nothing in return. It is yours." I looked down at the blank check resting on the table. It represented total instant financial freedom, a lottery ticket handed over by one of the wealthiest investors in the country. For a man allegedly living in a modest brick house on a meager pension, it was an offer that would induce instant tears of joy. Devin would have sold his own soul for this piece of paper. I did not reach for the gold pen. I did not look at the check with longing desperation or greed. I looked directly into Victoria Thorne's tired but piercing eyes, matching her intense sincerity with a cold, unwavering focus of my own. I placed my index finger on the center of the crisp paper and slowly, deliberately slid it back across the table until it rested perfectly in front of her. "I don't want your money, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping into a register of calm, lethal precision. "I want your leverage." Victoria blinked clearly, taken aback by the rejection. She was a woman highly accustomed to everyone in her orbit wanting a piece of her massive fortune. She looked at the rejected check, then back up at my face. Her sharp, predatory business instincts instantly locked into place, replacing the grieving mother with the apex CEO. "What exactly do you want, Vaughn?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. "The family that threw me out onto the street last night. The family that disgusted you. My son is married to their daughter. They believe they have completely isolated me. They aggressively drained my pension account to starve me out. And they forged my signature to leverage my only home just to fund their luxury facade. I want to utterly destroy them, but I do not want to do it quickly. I want them to dismantle their own lives piece by piece." Victoria's eyes darkened with sudden predatory understanding. She realized she was no longer speaking to a humble blue-collar hero. She was speaking to a peer operating on a completely different battlefield. "You hold 60% of the Kensington Group's toxic corporate debt." I continued, laying my cards on the table. "I am currently in the process of aggressively acquiring the other 40% through anonymous proxy firms. I am proposing a shadow alliance. If we perfectly coordinate our strikes, we can systematically crush them from both sides without them ever seeing the blade coming." Victoria leaned back in her chair, a slow, highly dangerous smile spreading across her face. It was the smile of a corporate apex predator who had just found the absolute perfect hunting partner. "The Kensingtons are incredibly desperate," she said, her voice turning razor sharp. "Pierce called my private office 6 times this morning, practically begging for a restructured loan agreement. He is drowning and he knows the water is rising fast. If I aggressively call in their short-term liabilities right now, demanding immediate liquid capital they absolutely do not possess, it will force a catastrophic margin call. They will have exactly 48 hours to produce millions in hard cash, or I will legally seize their corporate assets and their personal estates." I nodded slowly, calculating the exact pressure needed to seal the trap. If you squeeze them that hard, they will panic. Desperate people who are terrified of losing their false social status do not act rationally. They will be forced into a corner where legal ethical options no longer exist. They will have to commit a major financial crime just to survive the week and avoid total bankruptcy. And when they inevitably cross that legal line, I will be waiting in the dark to catch them in the act. Victoria picked up her heavy gold pen, folded the blank check in half, and slipped it seamlessly back into her blazer pocket. She extended her right hand across the table, not in gratitude this time, but sealing a ruthless, ironclad pact. "Consider the pressure applied, Vaughn. I will squeeze the Kensington family until they completely break." I shook her hand firmly, feeling the immense weight of the corporate guillotine we had just hoisted above my son and his arrogant in-laws. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was in place. Now all I had to do was step back into the shadows and wait for the rats to take the bite. I left the hospital feeling a profound sense of dark anticipation. The tactical alignment with Victoria Thorne secured the exact vice grip I needed to squeeze the Kensington family until they cracked. I returned to my quiet brick house on the south side, seeking the simple comfort of my own kitchen. My house was a modest fortress built with sturdy materials and filled with vintage radios I repaired by hand. It was the absolute antithesis of the fragile, over-leveraged mansions the Kensingtons flaunted. The afternoon sky was bruised with gray clouds, signaling an approaching storm. I walked inside, hung my worn canvas jacket on the rack, and walked to the kitchen counter to prepare a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The familiar grinding of the beans offered a brief moment of domestic peace. That peace shattered instantly. I heard the sharp metallic click of a key turning in the front door deadbolt. I had not given a spare key to anyone except my son. Devin had clearly handed over his access to his wealthy in-laws, completely violating the sanctuary of his childhood home. The heavy wooden door swung open without a single knock. Aggressive footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway. Pierce Kensington stepped into my living room, exuding a foul, uninvited arrogance. He wore a sharp charcoal suit looking entirely out of place against my faded rug and antique furniture. Meredith trailed right behind him, wrapping a cashmere shawl tightly around her shoulders as if the very air inside my house might infect her with poverty. They were not alone. Two massive bodyguards in matching black suits flanked them, stepping inside and aggressively closing the door behind them. They crossed their arms, effectively blocking the only exit to the street. Pierce surveyed my modest living room with a sneer of absolute disgust, treating my home like an inconvenient obstacle in his day. I stood behind my kitchen island, silently watching the vultures circle. Pierce did not offer a greeting. He marched straight to my kitchen island, slapping a heavy leather-bound folder onto the wooden surface. He opened it with a sharp flick of his wrist. He tossed a stack of glossy, high-end brochures onto the counter. The vibrant covers displayed smiling elderly people sitting in pristine gardens and sterile recreation rooms. They were promotional materials for assisted living facilities. Right beside the brochures, Pierce laid down a thick legal document. The bold heading identified it as a deed transfer contract. "You have caused an incredible amount of damage to my family," Pierce stated, his voice dripping with condescension and barely contained panic. "Because of your unhinged stunt at the gala, we are facing severe temporary liquidity issues. Your son Devin has been incredibly irresponsible with his finances, racking up massive debts to support a lifestyle he clearly cannot afford. He owes us, and by extension, you owe us." I looked down at the documents, then back at Pierce, maintaining a wall of absolute silence. Meredith stepped forward, tapping her manicured fingernail against the deed transfer. "We are offering you a highly generous way out of the mess you created," she said, her tone falsely sweet and deeply venomous. "Sign this house over to us to clear Devin's outstanding financial obligations. In exchange, we will graciously secure you a spot in one of these lovely retirement communities. It is exactly where a man of your advanced age and deteriorating mental condition belongs anyway." Pierce leaned over the counter, placing both hands flat on the wood, attempting to tower over me. "Let us be absolutely clear, Vaughn. If you refuse to sign this property over today, we will go straight to the state authorities. We will officially report your rapid mental decline. We will tell them how you wandered into a high society event covered in blood, acting violently, and suffering from severe dementia. With Devin verifying our claims as your primary relative, the state will declare you mentally incompetent. They will seize your assets, force you into a state-run ward, and you will lose everything. Sign the house over to us right now, or we will legally strip you of your fundamental human rights." They were executing a classic brutal shakedown. They needed the equity in my brick house to temporarily stave off Victoria Thorne's crushing debt collection. They were fully prepared to commit elder abuse, perjury, and extortion to buy themselves a few more days of financial survival. The bodyguards shifted their weight, cracking their knuckles to add physical intimidation to Pierce's verbal threat. They expected me to tremble. They expected the terror of forced institutionalization to instantly break my spirit and force my hand toward the pen. I did not reach for a pen. I turned my back on Pierce Kensington completely. I reached for my favorite ceramic mug, lifted the glass carafe from the coffee maker, and slowly, methodically poured myself a steaming cup of black coffee. The dark liquid filled the mug with a rich, comforting aroma, entirely ignoring the aggressive tension radiating through the room. I set the carafe down, picked up my mug, and turned back to face the intruders. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot coffee, letting the silence stretch until the air in the kitchen became suffocating. Pierce's arrogant smirk began to falter, replaced by a sharp flicker of genuine confusion. He could not comprehend a man who did not cower before his wealth. I set my mug down on the counter with a soft thud. I picked up the thick deed transfer contract with both hands. I looked Pierce dead in the eyes, matching his desperate, bullying gaze with an empty, frozen void. Without breaking eye contact for a single second, I gripped the heavy paper and tore the entire legal document perfectly down the middle. I stacked the torn halves together, tore them a second time, and dropped the shredded pieces directly into the trash can resting beside the kitchen island. The veins in Pierce's neck bulged against his starched white collar. His face turned a violent, bruised shade of purple. The sheer disrespect of my action hit him like a physical blow to the jaw. "You arrogant old fool!" Pierce screamed, his carefully crafted elite persona shattering into pieces of raw, unhinged fury. "You just signed your own death warrant. I will bring the full weight of my legal team down on your miserable head. I will personally ensure you are locked inside a padded room medicated until you cannot remember your own name. I will crush you into dust and leave you completely homeless on the streets." Meredith grabbed her husband's arm, her face pale with a mix of anger and sudden apprehension. I did not offer a single word of defense. I did not argue or attempt to throw them out. I simply picked up my ceramic mug, took another long, slow sip of the dark coffee, and stared at him with the absolute calm of a man watching a trapped animal thrash against a snare. My silence enraged him further, robbing him of the fearful reaction he so desperately craved. Pierce gestured wildly to his bodyguards. "We are leaving!" he barked, his voice hoarse from shouting. "You have exactly 24 hours before my lawyers file the emergency conservatorship. Enjoy your last day of freedom, Hayes." The bodyguards opened the front door, stepping aside as Pierce and Meredith stormed out into the chilling afternoon air. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, shaking the dust from the doorframe. I stood alone in my kitchen, finishing my coffee in perfect peace. Pierce had just declared legal war. He was completely unaware that he had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to publicly execute his entire family. The digital assault commenced before the sun had even fully risen the following day. I was sitting at my kitchen island finishing my first cup of dark roast coffee when a notification flashed across my tablet screen. It was an urgent alert from a local community network board forwarded to me by Alejandro with a simple, stark message attached. "Watch this immediately." I tapped the link, and a high-definition video filled my screen. Courtney was sitting on a plush velvet sofa in her opulent living room. She looked drastically different from her usual immaculate self. She wore no makeup, her hair was pulled back into a messy, disheveled knot, and she was wearing a deliberately oversized plain gray sweater. It was a masterclass in theatrical vulnerability. She stared directly into the camera lens, her eyes welling up with thick, perfectly timed tears. Her voice trembled with calculated fragility as she addressed the local public. "My family is currently living a complete nightmare," Courtney whispered, wiping a single tear from her cheek. "My father-in-law, a man we love deeply, is suffering from a violent, rapid onset of severe dementia. He showed up to my parents' anniversary gala completely covered in blood-screaming obscenities and acting totally detached from reality. He has become a massive physical danger to himself and to everyone around him. He recently broke into our home, threatened my husband, and refuses to seek the medical help he so desperately requires. We are terrified for our safety." The video was a flawless execution of character assassination. She painted me not as a hero who had just saved a child from a burning car, but as a deranged, unpredictable monster roaming the streets. She completely omitted the accident, weaponizing the blood on my tuxedo to construct a horrifying narrative of mental collapse. Within hours, the video had gone wildly viral across the city's elite social circles and local neighborhood groups. Thousands of shares, likes and comments poured in from outraged citizens and sympathetic friends, all offering their prayers for her supposed bravery. She had effectively branded me a lunatic in the court of public opinion. The video itself was a brutal strike against my reputation, but it was merely the bait for a much more sinister trap. Directly below the viral video was a prominent link leading to a newly established crowdfunding page. Devin had personally authored the campaign, titling it with sickening sentimentality, "Help us save my father's broken mind." I clicked on the link and read the detailed description. Devin had crafted a heart-wrenching, entirely fabricated story about the devastating emotional toll of watching a proud veteran lose his grip on reality. He wrote that the state-run psychiatric facilities were utterly ill-equipped to handle my violent outbursts. He claimed that to properly protect me from harming myself or the public, they urgently needed to place me in an exclusive, high-security private behavioral health facility. The campaign was asking for a staggering $100,000 to cover my alleged involuntary commitment and the mounting legal fees required to secure my safety. The financial counter on the page was ticking upward at a terrifying speed. Wealthy acquaintances of the Kensington family, former colleagues of Devin, and countless gullible strangers were donating thousands of dollars by the minute. They were aggressively monetizing their own lie, stealing from the public under the guise of an emergency medical intervention to line their own empty pockets. The consequences of their massive digital smear campaigns spilled over into my physical reality almost instantly. Later that afternoon, I put on my worn canvas jacket and stepped outside to retrieve my mail from the rusted box at the end of my driveway. The atmosphere on my street had shifted entirely. A woman who had lived 3 doors down for over a decade was walking her golden retriever on my side of the pavement. The moment she saw me step onto my porch, her eyes widened in sheer panic. She aggressively yanked her dog's leash, practically sprinting across the street to avoid walking anywhere near my property. The mail carrier, a young man who usually waved and shouted a friendly greeting, kept his head strictly down, shoved my letters into the box with trembling hands, and hurried back to his postal truck. Devin and Courtney had successfully infected my entire neighborhood with fear. They wanted me to feel utterly isolated, universally despised, and completely trapped. An ordinary man would have immediately taken to the internet to violently defend his honor. He would have recorded his own frantic video, desperately trying to scream the truth over the deafening noise of the lie, inevitably looking exactly as unhinged as his attackers claimed he was. I did not engage in their digital circus. I walked calmly back inside my house, locked the heavy wooden door, and initiated a secure video conference with Alejandro. He appeared on my screen sitting in his sterile penthouse office sipping a glass of iced water. Alejandro did not offer any empty condolences regarding my ruined public image. He only offered lethal legal strategy. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously archiving every single piece of their public charade. Alejandro utilized specialized forensic software to capture indisputable screenshots of Courtney's video, saving the exact timestamps and viewer metrics. We documented every single donation that flowed into Devin's fraudulent campaign, tracing the financial data and archiving the false medical claims he had published. "They think they are winning a public relations war," Alejandro stated, his voice ringing with cold satisfaction. "They do not realize they are actively handing us a meticulously documented, publicly verifiable confession to multiple federal crimes. Every single dollar they collect through that fraudulent campaign is a distinct, undeniable count of wire fraud committed across state lines." Furthermore, Courtney's video constitutes egregious defamation per se. They are recklessly digging their own graves and eagerly broadcasting the excavation to the entire world. I watched the donation counter on Devin's page cross the $25,000 mark. "Let them keep digging," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of panic. "Make absolutely sure our digital net catches every single penny." I closed the laptop, feeling a profound sense of dark clarity. The Kensingtons were burning through their absolute last reserves of social capital, totally unaware that the financial snare Victoria Thorne and I had engineered was already closing tightly around their corporate throats. They were distracted by their own petty malice, entirely focused on destroying a lone old man while their massive empire quietly bled out in the background. I walked into my kitchen to pour a fresh cup of coffee, feeling the quiet rhythm of my house settle around me. Then a sharp, aggressive knock hammered against my front door. It was not the polite tap of a neighbor or the routine drop of a delivery driver. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding that demanded immediate attention. I set my empty mug on the counter and walked slowly down the hallway. I pulled open the heavy wooden door. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a cheap gray suit stood on my porch. His face was entirely devoid of expression, projecting the bored, mechanical demeanor of a man who delivered bad news for a living. He held a thick, sealed manila envelope in his right hand. "Are you Vaughn Hayes?" the man asked, his tone flat and official. "I am," I replied calmly, meeting his apathetic gaze without a flinch. The man stepped forward firmly, pressing the heavy manila envelope directly against my chest. "Consider yourself officially served," he stated. He immediately turned on his heel and walked swiftly down my driveway, getting into an unmarked sedan and speeding away without looking back. I stood on my porch, feeling the cold wind bite at my face. I looked down at the thick envelope resting in my hands. The official seal of the state family court was stamped clearly across the front flap. I broke the seal and pulled out the dense stack of legal documents. The bold, aggressive lettering at the top of the first page confirmed exactly what Pierce Kensington had threatened. Devin had officially filed an aggressive, expedited petition for emergency conservatorship. He was legally demanding that the state strip me of my fundamental human rights, seize total control of my finances, and mandate my involuntary commitment to a psychiatric ward. The court date was already set. The ultimate showdown had been formally triggered. The mahogany-paneled courtroom of the family court division was suffocatingly quiet. The heavy oak doors had closed firmly behind us, sealing everyone inside a room designed specifically to legally dismantle human independence. Pierce and Meredith Kensington sat perfectly poised in the front row of the gallery, exuding an air of impenetrable, aristocratic confidence. They wore muted conservative colors, projecting the false image of a deeply concerned family reluctantly performing a painful civic duty. Courtney sat directly behind her husband, her face a mask of solemn, manufactured grief. Devon was seated at the petitioner's table alongside a highly aggressive, expensive litigator whom the Kensingtons had undoubtedly financed. As the hearing officially commenced, Devon took the stand. He delivered an absolute masterclass in theatrical manipulation. His voice broke at exactly the right moments. He pressed a crisp, white handkerchief to his eyes, shedding genuine tears over his fabricated tragedy. He spoke passionately to the judge about how much he loved his father and how utterly devastating it was to witness a proud, strong man succumb to rapid, violent cognitive decay. He painted a heartbreaking, utterly false picture of a son desperately trying to save a father who was rapidly becoming a danger to the entire community. Devon's attorney then seized control of the narrative, launching a brutal, calculated offensive designed to completely destroy my credibility. The attorney paced the floor, his voice rising in dramatic cadence as he weaponized the events of the anniversary gala. He described in horrifying detail how I had allegedly invaded an exclusive private celebration, completely drenched in human blood. He claimed I was shouting incoherently, physically, threatening the elite guests, and displaying severe, uncontrollable psychotic aggression. He twisted the tragic reality of pulling a dying child from a burning vehicle into a terrifying, baseless story of a deranged, violent lunatic wandering the city streets looking for a fight. He argued passionately that my behavior was not merely erratic, but presented an immediate catastrophic threat to public safety. He pointed directly at me, demanding that the court act swiftly to place me in a highly secure, locked psychiatric facility before I could cause any further physical harm. The judge, an older, stern-looking woman with a reputation for zero tolerance, leaned forward, her expression darkening as she absorbed the horrifying, completely false narrative they had so meticulously constructed. Alejandro Vargas did not object during their relentless assault. He sat beside me at the respondents' table, his posture relaxed, his dark eyes watching their performance with the cold, detached patience of a sniper waiting for the target to walk directly into the crosshairs. When it was finally his turn to present our defense, Alejandro did not waste time with emotional appeals or dramatic rhetoric. He stood up, adjusted his bespoke jacket, and approached the bench. He handed the judge a thick, officially sealed medical folder. This, Alejandro stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority, is a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted less than 48 hours ago by Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief of neurology at the State Medical Board. It completely certifies that Mr. Hayes possesses flawless cognitive function, zero signs of dementia, and an intellect sharper than most men half his age. The judge flipped through the heavily stamped documents, her frown deepening. Alejandro did not stop there. He turned toward a large monitor positioned in the center of the courtroom. He tapped a command on his tablet. High-definition security footage from the Waldorf Astoria lobby flooded the screen. The video obtained through a swift, aggressive subpoena played in undeniable, agonizing clarity. The entire courtroom watched as Pierce Kensington casually snapped his fingers. They watched 4 massive security guards brutally grab my arms, twist them behind my back, and violently hurl me out the front doors. They watched Devon stand idly by, making absolutely no move to protect or defend his father. The silence in the courtroom morphed instantly into a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The judge stared at the frozen final frame of the security footage, her face turning an alarming, rigid shade of white. She slowly shifted her piercing gaze from the monitor directly to Devon, and then to Pierce Kensington sitting smugly in the gallery. The sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from the bench was palpable. She slammed her wooden gavel down with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot. "This petition is entirely baseless and utterly repugnant," she stated, her voice shaking with contained outrage. She immediately dismissed the case with extreme prejudice, slamming the heavy file shut. She then pointed the head of her gavel directly at Devon. "Mr. Hayes," she warned, her tone lethally cold, "you are treading dangerously close to felony perjury. If you ever attempt to manipulate this court again to facilitate elder abuse, I will personally ensure you leave this building in handcuffs." The loud final crack of the gavel sealed their defeat. The color completely drained from Pierce Kensington's face. His jaw went slack, his eyes widening in sudden absolute terror as the devastating reality of the ruling washed over him. They had just permanently lost their only legal avenue to steal my home, and with it, they had lost their final desperate chance to stave off complete corporate annihilation. The corporate guillotine fell exactly 2 hours after the judge slammed her gavel. Victoria Thorne did not waste a single second celebrating our victory in family court. She returned to her sleek executive office and immediately unleashed absolute financial devastation upon the Kensington Group. A team of high-powered couriers arrived at the towering iron gates of the Kensington estate, simultaneously delivering identical heavily bound legal notices directly into Pierce's trembling hands. The documents were uncompromising and lethal. Victoria had officially called in the entirety of their massive toxic loans. The grace periods were immediately revoked. The restructuring negotiations were permanently canceled. The legal notice gave the Kensington family exactly 48 hours to produce a staggering sum of liquid cash to cover the immediate margin calls. If they failed to wire the funds by the deadline, Victoria would execute a hostile asset seizure. She would legally strip them of their corporate headquarters, their commercial real estate portfolio, their luxury vehicles, and the very mansion they were currently standing inside. Total panic consumed the Kensington household. The carefully curated facade of aristocratic grace evaporated into shrieking desperation. Standing in the center of their grand foyer, Courtney completely lost her mind. She hurled a priceless crystal vase against the marble wall, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces. She turned her unhinged fury entirely onto Devon. She screamed that he was completely useless, a pathetic failure who had dragged her family into ruin because he could not even control his own elderly father. She cornered him against the sweeping mahogany staircase, jabbing her manicured finger into his chest. She demanded that he fix the situation immediately. She did not care how he did it, what laws he had to break, or who he had to hurt. She told him that if he did not walk back through their front doors with enough capital to stall Victoria Thorne, she would divorce him and leave him with absolutely nothing. Devon was entirely out of legal options. The courts had rejected his fraudulent conservatorship. His bank accounts were frozen or empty. The suffocating pressure from his vicious wife pushed his desperate mind toward the only remaining source of wealth he knew. He remembered my private study. He remembered the heavy vintage steel safe hidden behind the oak bookshelf. He knew that inside that safe rested Camille's antique heirloom jewelry, a collection of rare diamonds and gold pieces worth tens of thousands of dollars on the black market. It was enough fast cash to secure a temporary legal injunction against the asset seizure. Driven by sheer blind panic and the terrifying threat of losing his wealthy lifestyle, my son decided to cross the absolute point of no return. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed a harsh red, displaying exactly 2 in the morning. The neighborhood was dead silent, wrapped in the cold, biting grip of the early morning hours. I was not asleep. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. When you back a desperate, greedy animal into a tight corner, it will inevitably resort to its most primal, destructive instincts. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather armchair tucked into the darkest corner of my study. I wore my dark canvas jacket, a cup of lukewarm black coffee, resting untouched on the side table beside me. I waited in the pitch black, listening to the quiet settling of the old brick house. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a soft scraping against the wooden frame of the back window leading into the laundry room. It was the specific window with the faulty latch, a minor defect Devon had known about since he was a teenager sneaking out of the house. A sharp, brittle snap echoed through the silent hallway as the aged locking mechanism gave way under the pressure of a steel crowbar. The heavy window slid upward with a low, agonizing groan. A dark shadow slipped over the sill, dropping onto the linoleum floor with a heavy, uncoordinated thud. Devon had broken into his childhood home. His erratic, heavy breathing traveled down the narrow corridor. He did not turn on his flashlight, relying entirely on his intimate memory of the house's layout. I watched from the shadows as the silhouette of my son crept into the study. He wore a black hooded sweatshirt, moving with the frantic, jerky motions of an amateur thief, terrified of his own shadow. He bypassed my desk entirely and went straight for the heavy oak bookshelf. He shoved his shoulder against the solid wood, grunting quietly as he pushed the heavy piece of furniture across the floor to reveal the vintage steel safe embedded in the wall. Devon dropped to his knees in front of the cold steel. He pulled a heavy metal crowbar and a heavy-duty screwdriver from his pockets. He was completely out of his depth, wildly attempting to wedge the flat edge of the crowbar into the microscopic seam of the safe's door. He pulled back with all his weight, panting heavily, but the solid steel did not yield a single millimeter. He cursed under his breath, a desperate, pathetic whimper escaping his throat. He dropped the crowbar and frantically began spinning the combination dial desperately, hoping he could guess the numbers his mother had chosen decades ago. He was sweating profusely, the sharp scent of his panic filling the small confined space of the study. He was tearing apart the sanctity of his mother's memory, eagerly willing to pawn her most treasured possessions just to buy another week of fake luxury with a woman who actively despised him. I reached out and placed my hand on the brass switch of the brass reading lamp beside my chair. With a single sharp click, the room was instantly flooded with bright, blinding light. Devin gasped violently, dropping his tools onto the hardwood floor with a loud metallic clatter. He whipped around, shielding his eyes from the sudden glare. He fell backward, scrambling away from the safe until his back hit the opposite wall. He stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice or reach for a weapon. I sat deeply in my leather armchair, my hands resting calmly on the armrests, looking down at the pathetic, trembling intruder sitting on my floor. I did not look at him with a shred of paternal disappointment or heartbreak. The father who had loved this boy died the moment the gavel fell in the courtroom. I looked at him with the cold, detached observation of a homeowner staring at a rat caught in a trap. "Dad." Devin stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pitiful squeak. His chest heaved as he frantically scrambled to formulate an excuse. "Dad, I can explain. Please, you have to listen to me. I was just checking on you. I came to make sure you were safe. I knocked, but you did not answer." "You broke through a locked window at 2 in the morning with a crowbar," I stated, my voice echoing with a low, lethal resonance. "You crept into my study in the dark and attempted to force open your dead mother's safe. You came here to steal from a ghost just to appease the vultures you married." Devin pushed himself up onto his knees, crawling slightly forward, pressing his hands together in a pathetic gesture of begging. "We are desperate, Dad. Courtney is going to leave me. Pierce is going to ruin me. They are blaming me for everything. You have all that money hidden away. You do not even need her jewelry. If you just give me the contents of the safe, I can fix everything. I can make them stop. You have to save me." I watched a grown man, a man I had worked 3 jobs to educate, beg to steal from his own family rather than face the consequences of his actions. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not need to dial 911. The moment the faulty latch on the back window had snapped, the silent alarm system I had installed triggered a priority alert directly to the local police precinct. I pressed a single button on my screen, disabling the quiet mode on my security dashboard. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was suddenly shattered by the piercing wail of approaching sirens. Devin froze, the blood completely draining from his face. He scrambled to his feet, turning frantically toward the front of the house. Through the heavy curtains of the living room, brilliant flashes of red and blue light violently painted the walls. The sirens wailed louder, screeching to a halt directly on my front lawn. Heavy boots pounded up the wooden steps of my porch. "You called the cops on your own son," Devin whispered, his voice shaking with absolute disbelief. I stood up from my chair, adjusting the cuffs of my canvas jacket. I walked slowly across the room, stepping firmly over the discarded crowbar resting on the floor. I stopped just inches from his trembling face. "You are no longer my son," I said, my voice striking him with the crushing weight of an iron vault swinging shut. "You are a felon who broke into my property." The heavy front door was kicked open by the responding officers. Flashlights swept down the hallway, aggressively cutting through the darkness. 3 armed officers rushed into the study, shouting commands. Devin did not resist. He raised his trembling hands in the air, sobbing openly as the officers grabbed his arms, spun him around, and slammed him against the wall. The cold, sharp click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed through the room. They read him, his Miranda rights aggressively, marching him down the hallway and out the front door. I stood on my porch, bathed in the flashing police lights, watching calmly as the officers forced my former bloodline into the back of a squad car and drove him away into the dark. The final tie was permanently severed. The total destruction of the Kensington Empire could now proceed without a single distraction. The sterile, biting cold of the county jail holding cell seeped straight through the thin fabric of Devin's hooded sweatshirt. He sat huddled on a solid concrete bench, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, trembling uncontrollably under the harsh, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights. The overwhelming stench of bleach, stale sweat, and sheer desperation coated the back of his throat. Less than 24 hours ago, he was wearing a custom silk tie and sipping vintage champagne in the grand lobby of the Waldorf Astoria. Now he was locked in a steel cage alongside men who stared at him with hardened, predatory eyes. The crushing reality of his situation had finally breached his thick wall of arrogance. He was a convicted felon in waiting. The heavy iron door down the corridor clattered open and a uniformed guard banged a nightstick against the metal bars of his cell. The guard pointed a thick finger at Devon, instructing him to step out for his legally mandated phone call. Devon practically tripped over his own feet, rushing to the wall-mounted receiver. He snatched the heavy plastic handset with shaking, bruised fingers and frantically punched in Courtney's private cell phone number. He held his breath, desperately waiting for the familiar, arrogant voice of his wife. He fully expected the Kensington wealth to swoop down like a golden safety net. He expected high-priced defense attorneys to walk through the precinct doors at any moment, treating his felony burglary arrest as a minor, easily fixable administrative error. The line rang 3 times before connecting. Courtney answered the phone, but the voice that greeted him held absolutely zero comfort. There was no relief, no panic for his safety, and certainly no love. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Courtney hissed into the receiver, her voice dropping into a vicious, lethal whisper. Devon choked back a sob, gripping the phone cord so tightly his knuckles turned a bruised white. "Courtney, please, you have to get me out of here," he begged, his voice cracking with raw terror. "They took my shoelaces. They fingerprinted me. You need to call your father and have him wire the bail money right now." A harsh, chilling laugh echoed across the line. It was not Courtney laughing. It was Pierce Kensington. The silver-haired patriarch had taken the phone from his daughter. "You truly are a spectacular failure," Devon Pierce stated, his tone devoid of any human empathy. "You were given one simple task to secure capital, and instead, you got yourself arrested for breaking and entering like a common street thug." Devon's stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. "Pierce, please," he pleaded, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "It was a mistake. Just post the bond. I will make it up to you. I will fix everything." Pierce cut him off with the brutal efficiency of a corporate executioner. "We are not posting a single dime for your bail." Devon froze the air, leaving his lungs. Pierce explained the grim, selfish reality with absolute clarity. If the Kensington family posted a massive cash bond for a felony burglary charge, the state would instantly demand a thorough financial audit to verify the source of the funds. A police audit into Devon's frozen accounts would inevitably uncover the forged mortgage signature on his father's house. That discovery would act as a lit match, directly illuminating the massive tangled web of corporate fraud shell companies and illegal wire transfers the Kensingtons were currently using to hide their remaining assets from Victoria Thorne. "You are a massive liability," Pierce declared coldly. "If the police look at your finances, they look at ours. We cannot afford to be associated with a jailed felon right now. You are entirely on your own." The line went dead with a sharp click. Devon stood frozen against the cinderblock wall, listening to the dial tone. They had completely abandoned him to save their own crumbling empire. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of my brick house, casting a warm, peaceful glow over my kitchen. I sat at my island counter enjoying a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. The quiet solitude was a profound relief after the chaotic events of the night. Then my smartphone buzzed against the wooden surface. The caller ID displayed Courtney's name. I let it ring 4 times, taking a slow sip of my coffee before finally pressing the green button. I did not say hello. I simply waited for her to speak. "Vaughn, you need to get down to the county precinct right this second," Courtney demanded, her voice vibrating with sheer, unadulterated audacity. She spoke to me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a wealthy plantation owner issuing an order to a disobedient servant. "Your son is sitting in a jail cell because of your ridiculous overreaction last night. You need to drop the charges, pay his bail, and get him out of there immediately before the local press gets hold of the arrest records. We absolutely cannot afford a public scandal of this magnitude tied to our family name right now. Fix your son's mess." I listened to her shrill, demanding voice, marveling at the boundless depths of her delusion. She had just publicly branded me a violent, deranged lunatic on the internet to steal my money. She had driven my son to break into my home with a crowbar. And now, when her own family refused to open their wallets to save him, she expected the man she tried to destroy to blindly rush to the rescue. A slow, dark amusement bubbled up inside my chest. I let out a cold, hollow laugh that echoed sharply through the phone. "You threw me to the wolves, Courtney," I replied, my voice dropping into a smooth, lethal register. "And now you expect me to buy back the trash you discarded. Your husband is exactly where he belongs. Do not ever call this number again." I pressed the red button, cutting off her furious screech mid-sentence. Back in the damp, freezing confines of the county jail, desperation drove Devon to the absolute breaking point. He was huddled in the darkest corner of the holding cell, shaking violently. A hardened inmate sitting on the opposite bench had been watching him quietly. For the price of Devon's designer gold watch, the inmate slipped a scratched, smuggled burner cell phone out of his sock and slid it across the concrete floor. Devon snatched the contraband device with trembling hands. He had exactly one lifeline left in the entire world. He punched in my phone number, praying to a god he had long ignored. In my kitchen, my phone buzzed again. I saw an unknown, unregistered number flash across the screen. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear in total silence. Dad Devon sobbed, his voice completely broken, reduced to the pathetic, terrified whimpers of a frightened child. "Dad, please, I am so sorry. They abandoned me. Courtney left me here. I have nothing. Please, I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just do not leave me in this cage. Please, Dad." I sat perfectly still, holding the phone against my ear. I listened to the raw, agonizing sound of his weeping. I listened to the sheer terror vibrating in his throat. I let the sound wash over me for exactly 5 seconds. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, a single shred of paternal instinct urging me to protect my boy. I found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel. "Actions have consequences," I stated. I pulled the phone away from my face and ended the call. The financial news networks broke the story just before the opening bell. The Kensington Group, a towering titan of luxury real estate and elite social capital, officially filed for Chapter 11 insolvency. Victoria Thorne had executed her threat with surgical, absolute devastation. The massive margin call had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction, freezing their credit lines and sending their violently overvalued stock plummeting into the abyss. Inside the fortified walls of his sprawling estate, Pierce Kensington was sweating through his bespoke shirt. The aristocratic facade had completely melted away, leaving a desperate, cornered criminal. He paced the length of his mahogany-paneled home office, barking frantic orders into a secure phone line. He instructed his most compromised accountants and a handful of heavily bribed board members to immediately convene an emergency closed-door shareholder meeting. Their objective was entirely illegal. Pierce was orchestrating a desperate maneuver to liquidate the company's last remaining cash reserves, intending to wire the capital through a tangled web of anonymous shell companies straight into an untouchable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was fully prepared to let the entire corporation burn to the ground, leaving thousands of employees and contractors completely ruined, so long as he and Meredith could escape the country with a golden parachute. He believed that because the stock had cratered, no rational investor would dare touch the radioactive wreckage of his empire. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, operating in total secrecy. He was completely unaware that every single panicked move he made was being closely monitored on a glowing digital display sitting halfway across the city. Courtney was locked in the master suite, furiously packing designer bags, desperately trying to salvage her diamond collection before the federal auditors arrived to seize their physical assets. She had abandoned Devon to rot in a county jail cell, completely consumed by her own financial survival. The Kensington family was fracturing under the immense pressure, bound together only by their shared greed and the frantic desire to steal whatever loose change remained in the corporate vault before the doors locked forever. High above the panicked chaos of the Kensington estate, the atmosphere inside Alejandro Vargas's penthouse office was chillingly serene. The massive flat-screen monitors mounted on the frosted glass walls displayed the rapidly cascading stock price of the Kensington Group in bright, bleeding red numbers. I sat in the heavy leather chair across from Alejandro, watching the empire that had humiliated me crumble into financial dust. The stock was currently trading for literal pennies on the dollar. Institutional investors were fleeing the radioactive asset in droves, dumping their shares in a blind panic to avoid total loss. It was a corporate bloodbath. Alejandro typed a rapid sequence of commands into his encrypted terminal, his dark eyes reflecting the glowing data. "The time to strike is right now," Alejandro stated, his voice devoid of emotion but laced with predatory precision. "Pierce has effectively tanked his own valuation by calling the emergency shareholder meeting. He triggered a temporary halt on internal trading, but the public float is completely exposed. I gave a single firm nod. Do it. Open the floodgates. Alejandro hit the execution key. We weaponized the immense, untouched wealth sitting dormant in Camille's trust fund. The millions generated by my late wife's brilliant biochemical patents poured into the open market like a devastating tidal wave. To completely mask my identity, Alejandro did not buy the shares under my name. He utilized a complex network of anonymous proxy firms, blind trusts, and deeply buried holding companies. These invisible entities began aggressively scooping up every single available share of the Kensington Group that panicked investors were dumping. We bought blocks of millions of shares at a time, entirely overwhelming the market volume. The speed and ferocity of the acquisition were staggering, because Pierce was entirely focused on his illegal offshore wire transfers. He was completely blind to the massive accumulation occurring right beneath his nose. He assumed the sudden spike in trading volume was simply dead cat bounces or algorithmic day traders scavenging the wreckage. He had absolutely no idea that a highly coordinated, incredibly hostile takeover was being executed with surgical perfection. The wealth I had hidden for decades to protect my son from corruption was now being deployed to utterly annihilate the people who had corrupted him. The numbers on Alejandro's screen climbed steadily: 30%, 40%, 49%. The final digital confirmation chimed softly in the quiet office. Alejandro leaned back in his chair, a rare, terrifying smile curving the corners of his mouth. He pressed a button on his desk console, and a heavy laser printer in the corner hummed to life, churning out a thick stack of legal documents. He gathered the warm papers, placed them inside a black leather binder, and slid it across the polished obsidian desk toward me. "The acquisition is completely finalized," Alejandro announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "The proxy firms have officially consolidated their voting rights. You now possess exactly 51% of the Kensington Group's total outstanding shares. You hold the absolute, unquestionable controlling interest." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a simple black pen, and signed my name on the consolidated ownership transfer line. The ink dried on the page, solidifying a monumental shift in power. I looked down at the signature, feeling a profound, icy satisfaction settle deep into my bones. The people who had ordered their security guards to forcefully twist my arms behind my back, the people who had publicly thrown me onto the freezing concrete sidewalk like a piece of worthless garbage, were now legally my direct employees. I owned the very ground they walked on. I owned their corporate headquarters. I owned their desks, their titles, and their remaining professional dignity. They believed they were the untouchable elite perched high above the working class. They were about to discover that the man they had treated as a filthy vagrant now held the absolute power to legally erase their entire existence. The next morning, I stood in the center of an exclusive, dimly lit fitting room in the city's most elite tailoring house. The walls were lined with rich mahogany and shelves of imported Italian fabrics. I was no longer wearing my faded canvas jacket or scuffed work boots. I stood before a towering three-way antique mirror, looking at a reflection that felt both entirely new and long overdue. A master tailor was kneeling at my feet, making microscopic, meticulous adjustments to the hem of a flawless, custom-made Tom Ford suit. The fabric was a deep, midnight charcoal woven from a wool so fine it felt like liquid armor. The cut was aggressive and commanding, broadening my shoulders and instantly stripping away the unassuming blue-collar disguise I had worn for decades. The crisp white shirt underneath was immaculate, a stark contrast to the rented, blood-soaked garment I had worn the night of the anniversary gala. I fastened a heavy, brushed steel watch around my wrist, feeling the cold weight of the metal lock into place. The transformation was absolute. I did not look like a humble, retired delivery driver trying to blend into the background. I looked like an apex corporate executioner. I looked like a man who commanded empires with a single word. Alejandro stood by the mahogany door, checking his phone. "The emergency shareholder meeting starts in exactly 1 hour, he stated, looking up at my reflection. "Pierce is currently locking down the boardroom. He thinks he is about to finalize his offshore escape." I adjusted my silk tie, my eyes locked on my own cold reflection in the glass. "Tell the driver to pull the car around," I replied, my voice echoing with dark, lethal anticipation. "I am completely ready for the slaughter." High above the city, the executive boardroom of the Kensington Group was a monument to corporate excess. A massive table carved from a single slab of polished mahogany dominated the center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the skyline. The atmosphere inside was thick with the suffocating tension of desperate criminals pulling off a final frantic heist. Every tick of the designer clock on the wall was a countdown to their financial execution. Pierce Kensington stood at the head of the table, flanked by a handful of deeply compromised board members and his most corrupt accountants. Meredith sat rigidly in a leather chair to his right, nervously twisting a diamond ring on her finger. Courtney hovered near the windows, aggressively chewing on her manicured thumbnail, entirely consumed by the selfish need to secure her own financial survival. She had completely forgotten about her husband rotting in a county jail cell. Pierce smoothed the lapels of his suit and looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished wood. These were the offshore wire authorizations. With a single signature, he was about to illegally funnel the company's last remaining liquid assets into an untraceable shell account in the Cayman Islands. He was fully prepared to let the corporation burn to ash, leaving his employees jobless and his creditors holding worthless paper. A smug, arrogant smile crept across his face as he picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his co-conspirators. He confidently announced that they had successfully weathered the storm, outsmarted Victoria Thorne, and secured their elite status. He positioned the gold nib of the pen over the signature line, fully believing he had just won the ultimate game of corporate survival. The heavy, double-paned glass doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were shoved violently apart, the heavy brass handles hitting the interior walls with a resounding, thunderous crack. The arrogant murmurs of the corrupt board members instantly died in their throats. Pierce froze the gold pen, hovering a fraction of an inch above the offshore transfer documents. I stepped into the room. The transition from the man they had discarded to the man standing before them was absolute and jarring. I did not look like the exhausted, blood-soaked father they had ordered their security guards to brutalize. I did not look like a blue-collar mechanic they could starve into submission. The bespoke midnight charcoal Tom Ford suit draped over my shoulders like perfectly forged armor. The crisp lines of the fabric, the sharp cut of the lapels, and the heavy steel watch on my wrist radiated a cold, undeniable authority. I felt the weight of decades of honest labor in my stride, fueled by the righteous fury of a father scorned. I walked with the measured, predatory rhythm of a combat veteran who had just stepped onto an active battlefield. I did not walk alone. Alejandro Vargas strode purposefully on my right side, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase that held the financial execution orders. On my left walked Victoria Thorne. She wore a sharp crimson blazer, her posture rigid and her eyes blazing with absolute, unadulterated vengeance. The synchronized rhythmic clicking of our shoes against the hardwood floor echoed through the dead silence of the boardroom like the steady ticking of a bomb. Every eye in the room locked onto us in a state of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Pierce looked up from his documents, his brain completely short-circuited trying to process the visual information. He recognized Victoria first, his eyes widening in sudden, panicked realization that his primary creditor had physically breached his sanctuary. He recognized Alejandro second, identifying the infamous corporate assassin whose presence in a boardroom always signaled total annihilation. Finally, his gaze shifted to the center of the formation, his eyes locked onto my face. The smug confidence evaporated from his features, replaced by a deep, primal confusion. He recognized the facial structure of the man he had thrown out onto the freezing concrete, but his arrogant mind utterly failed to reconcile that memory with the powerful, commanding titan currently standing in his boardroom. The sheer cognitive dissonance fractured Pierce's composure. His survival instincts kicked in, manifesting as a violent defensive rage. The aristocratic mask slipped completely, revealing the terrified, cornered animal underneath. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, his face turning a chaotic, blotchy shade of crimson. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. Security Pierce screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with panicked hysteria. "Get security up here right this second. How the hell did this trash get past the lobby desk? I demand to know who let this filthy vagrant into my building. Remove him immediately." He looked wildly toward the boardroom doors, expecting his heavily armed guards to rush in and execute his aggressive commands just as they had done at the Waldorf Astoria. No one came. He hammered the intercom button on the console, but the line was dead. Alejandro had already neutralized the building's internal communications. The hallway outside remained completely empty and silent. Pierce turned his frantic gaze toward Victoria, desperately trying to salvage his crumbling authority. "Victoria, I apologize for this disgusting intrusion," he stammered, his voice laced with sweat and panic. "I have no idea how this lunatic followed you up here. If you are here to discuss the margin call, I assure you the funds are being secured right this very minute. We just need to finalize this paperwork." Victoria did not flinch. She did not offer a polite corporate greeting or acknowledge his desperate, pathetic lies. She stepped forward, closing the distance to the heavy mahogany table. She raised her right hand and slammed her palm flat against the polished wood with a force that rattled the crystal water glasses resting in the center. The sharp, explosive sound completely silenced the room. "Shut your mouth," Pierce, Victoria commanded. Her voice was not a scream. It was a low, lethal vibration that cut straight through his arrogant delusion and pinned him directly to his chair. Pierce swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the suffocating silence. His trembling hand still gripped the gold fountain pen, hovering uselessly over the illegal offshore wire transfers. The remaining board members shrank back into their expensive leather chairs, desperately trying to distance themselves from the blast zone. Meredith clutched her cashmere shawl, her face entirely drained of color. Courtney was backed flat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. The arrogant daughter-in-law who had plotted to steal my modest brick house now realized she was standing in the presence of a true titan. The reality of my transformation was finally penetrating her shallow, materialistic mind. Victoria stood tall, her gaze sweeping over the pathetic remnants of the Kensington family with absolute disgust. "You are not securing any funds," Pierce, Victoria stated, her words dripping with pure, concentrated venom. "You are not signing a single document, and you are certainly not ordering security to remove anyone from this building ever again." Pierce opened his mouth to protest, a weak, desperate sound attempting to escape his lungs. Victoria cut him off with a sharp, sweeping gesture of her hand, pointing directly toward me. "You do not own this room anymore," Victoria declared, her voice ringing with the crushing weight of a falling guillotine. "Meet the new majority shareholder of your company." The heavy gold fountain pen slipped from Pierce's trembling fingers. It hit the mahogany table with a sharp final clatter, rolling aimlessly across the offshore transfer documents. He collapsed backward into his executive chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of absolute defeat. Courtney pressed her hands against the cold glass of the window, looking exactly like she had just seen a ghost. I stood at the head of the boardroom, looking down at the shattered ruins of the people who had tried to destroy me, ready to deliver the final execution. I stepped forward, the heavy soles of my shoes breaking the paralyzed silence of the room. The distance between the boardroom doors and the head of the mahogany table felt like a victory march decades in the making. I stopped directly beside Pierce Kensington. He was trembling violently, his perfectly styled silver hair now clinging to his forehead in damp, pathetic strands. I did not raise a hand or utter a single command. I simply looked down at him, my eyes carrying the absolute authority of a man who held his entire life in the palm of my hand. The message was unmistakable. "Get out of my chair." Pierce looked to his corrupt board members for support, but they completely averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by the wood grain of the table. He looked to Meredith, but she was shrinking into her cashmere shawl, terrified of drawing my attention. Defeated, utterly stripped of his power, Pierce slowly stood up. His legs shook so severely he had to lean against the edge of the table just to remain upright. He took 2 humiliating steps backward, surrendering the seat of absolute power. I did not rush the moment. I unbuttoned the front of my bespoke Tom Ford jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness and sat down in the high-backed leather chief executive chair. The expensive leather creaked softly under my weight. I rested my forearms on the polished mahogany, lacing my fingers together. The view from the top of the Kensington Empire was spectacular, but the view of Pierce standing like a reprimanded subordinate was infinitely better. "You built this room to intimidate working people," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the vast space. "You built it to make yourselves feel untouchable. True power is what you are looking at right now." Alejandro moved smoothly to my right side. He unclasped the brushed steel locks of his black leather briefcase with a sharp snap. He did not pull out a single sheet of paper. He extracted 3 massive, heavily bound legal folders and dropped them onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud made Courtney flinch violently by the window. Alejandro slid the first folder directly in front of Pierce. That contains the undeniable proof of wire fraud, Alejandro announced, his voice slicing through the room like a surgical scalpel. It is a complete forensic financial audit of the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign your family orchestrated. We have logged every single illegal donation crossing state lines, cementing dozens of federal charges. Alejandro slid the second folder forward. That contains the extortion and elder abuse documentation, including the deed transfer contract you attempted to force my client to sign under the threat of involuntary institutionalization. Then, Alejandro slid the thickest folder toward them. That is the forged second mortgage on my client's home, bearing the fraudulent signatures executed by Devin Hayes, actively facilitated and spent by your daughter. The paper trail directly links the stolen funds to Courtney's personal checking accounts. Pierce stared at the folders as if they were live explosives. His chest heaved with shallow, desperate breaths. He opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, a lie, anything to save his skin. "Please," Pierce stammered, the arrogant billionaire reduced to a begging coward. "We can make a deal. We can return the money. We can sign over our personal estates. Just keep this out of the federal courts. We are a respectable family. You cannot do this to us over a simple misunderstanding at a party." I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. I let the absolute silence stretch, allowing the gravity of his sins to completely crush him. "A misunderstanding," I repeated, the word dripping with lethal disdain. "You ordered your guards to twist my arms behind my back. You paraded me through your lobby and threw me onto the freezing concrete like an animal while I was covered in the blood of an innocent child. You did that because you thought I was poor. You thought I was weak. You threw me out because I stained your rug. I am throwing you out because you stained my air." The absolute finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. There would be no negotiations. There would be no mercy. I was not there to bargain with parasites. I was there to exterminate them. As the majority shareholder and acting chief executive of the Kensington Group, I am exercising my absolute corporate authority, I announced, my voice booming across the silent boardroom. "Pierce Kensington, you are officially terminated from your position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Meredith Kensington, your position on the advisory board is permanently revoked. Courtney, your vanity role as Vice President of Public Relations is completely dissolved. You are all fired." A collective gasp rippled through the remaining corrupt board members. Pierce clutched his chest, his breathing turning ragged. "You cannot do this," he wheezed. "We built this company. This is our legacy. You have no legacy." I corrected him sharply. "You have a mountain of toxic debt that I now personally own." Alejandro tapped a command on his secure tablet. "By my authority," Alejandro stated, "I have initiated a total freeze on all corporate assets, the executive bank accounts. The company credit cards, the luxury vehicle leases, and the corporate housing allowances are entirely suspended. Your access badges have been electronically deactivated. You are no longer permitted to access any company funds, nor can you enter any building owned by this corporation ever again. You are entirely locked out of the empire you stole from to survive." Meredith let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying her face in her hands. The reality of her immediate poverty was finally breaking her fragile aristocratic mind. They had walked into the boardroom expecting to secure millions in an offshore account. They were leaving it with absolutely nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs. The devastating reality of their instant bankruptcy sent Courtney over the absolute edge. She pushed herself off the floor-to-ceiling window, her face contorted in a mask of sheer, unhinged panic. She hyperventilated, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger aggressively in my direction. "You cannot leave us with nothing," Courtney screamed, her voice cracking with wild desperation. "Devin is your son. He is your direct bloodline. It does not matter what you do to my parents today because Devin is still the legal heir to your entire fortune. Whatever billions you have hidden away will eventually belong to my husband. Half of everything he owns is legally mine. You cannot stop us from taking what is ours." I did not react to her shrill, greedy outburst. I simply looked at Alejandro. He opened his black leather briefcase one final time. He extracted a single, heavily notarized sheet of paper and slid it across the mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of Courtney. I kept my eyes locked on her terrified face as she stared down at the document. "You should really advise your husband to read the fine print before he weaponizes the legal system." I stated, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "That is a binding legal clause enacted the exact second your husband filed the fraudulent emergency petition in family court. Devin legally waived all inheritance rights when he filed for conservatorship against me. He legally disinherited himself. Courtney's eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon on the page. Her breathing stopped entirely. The color drained from her face as the ultimate inescapable truth crashed down upon her. Devin was not a billionaire in waiting. He was not her golden ticket to endless wealth. Devin was sitting in a county jail cell facing serious felony charges, completely cut off from the only fortune that could have saved them. She realized in that exact, horrifying moment that she was permanently chained to a broke, destitute felon. The descent from the executive penthouse was the most agonizing journey the Kensington family had ever experienced. Stripped of their corporate access badges, their private drivers, and their dignity, they were escorted into a standard elevator by the very security personnel they once commanded. Cast out onto the bustling city sidewalk with absolutely no access to their frozen bank accounts, Pierce was forced to humiliate himself by begging a passing yellow taxi to accept the spare cash he kept in his silver money clip. The ride back to their sprawling estate was suffocatingly silent, heavy, with the terrifying reality of their sudden absolute poverty. But the true nightmare was only just beginning. As the taxi turned onto their exclusive tree-lined street and approached the towering iron gates of their mansion, the sheer scale of Victoria Thorne's financial execution became visible. The grand wrought iron gates were pushed wide open, 3 massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks were parked aggressively across the immaculate cobblestone driveway. Men in high-visibility vests were already hooking thick steel chains to Pierce's prized vintage Porsche and Meredith's brand-new Range Rover. A team of private bank contractors in cheap suits stood on the grand marble portico supervising a locksmith who was actively drilling out the brass deadbolts of the massive mahogany front doors. Pierce stumbled out of the taxi before it even came to a complete halt, his face a mask of blind, uncomprehending horror. He shouted at the contractors demanding they step away from his property, wildly claiming there had been a colossal banking error. The lead contractor did not flinch. He calmly pulled a thick stack of legally binding foreclosure documents from his briefcase and shoved them directly into Pierce's chest. The paperwork confirmed the absolute worst. The estate had been seized as collateral against their defaulted loans. They were not allowed to step a single foot inside to retrieve their designer clothing, their expensive art, or their hidden cash reserves. The bank owned the house. The bank owned the cars. The Kensingtons were officially penniless, permanently locked out of their own lives and completely homeless. The fragile aristocratic facade that had bound the Kensington family together for decades violently shattered right there on the pristine driveway. Meredith Kensington stared at the locksmith ripping the hardware out of her front door, and her mind completely snapped. She whipped around to face her husband, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged rage. She lunged at Pierce, striking his chest with her fists, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed down the elite street, entirely devoid of her usual refined grace. She called him a pathetic, useless failure. She shrieked that he had promised her security, that he had sworn his illegal offshore transfers would save them, and that his sheer arrogance had now left her sleeping on the street. Pierce raised his hands defensively, stumbling backward, trying to hush her before the wealthy neighbors looked out their windows, but Meredith was beyond silencing. She cursed his name, cursing the day she married him, completely abandoning the loyal wife persona she had worn for 30 years. She turned her back on him, storming down the driveway on foot, desperately trying to call her wealthy friends, entirely unaware that her social circle would instantly blackball her the second the news of their bankruptcy hit the local networks. Courtney stood near the idling taxi, watching the grotesque destruction of her parents' marriage with cold, calculating detachment. She did not shed a single tear for her father's ruined legacy or her mother's public breakdown. Her survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of shallow materialism, kicked into overdrive. She looked at the sprawling mansion she had grown up in, now securely locked behind bank tape. She looked at her father, a broken, defeated old man crying in his own driveway. Then she thought of Devin. She thought of the man sitting in a county jail cell, the man who had just legally disinherited himself from the only fortune that could have salvaged her lifestyle. He was no longer a golden ticket. He was a massive, heavy anchor tied directly to her ankles. Courtney did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She climbed back into the back seat of the yellow taxi, slamming the door shut. She ordered the driver to take her to the city center. completely abandoning her parents to their miserable fate. As the cab sped away from the seized estate, Courtney pulled her smartphone from her designer purse. Her fingers moved with ruthless mechanical precision. She opened a text message to her high-priced divorce attorney. The message was incredibly brief and devoid of any emotion. "File the divorce papers against Devin immediately," she typed. "Cut all ties. Send the documents to the county jail." She hit send, permanently erasing my son from her life without a single backward glance. Miles away, the heavy iron gates of the county detention center buzzed loudly before sliding open. Devin stepped out into the harsh gray light of the late afternoon. He was wearing the same wrinkled, sweat-stained suit he had worn when he was arrested in my study, completely stripped of his tie and shoelaces. The arraignment judge had granted him a state-appointed release bond, fully aware that the suspect had absolutely zero flight risk and zero financial resources. Devin walked down the concrete steps, clutching a small, clear plastic bag containing his wallet, his keys, and his smartphone. He looked around the barren industrial parking lot, desperately searching for Courtney's sleek luxury car or one of his father-in-law's black SUVs. The lot was completely empty. There was nobody waiting to welcome him back to freedom. There were no high-priced lawyers waiting to debrief him. He was utterly alone. His hands shook as he ripped open the plastic bag and pulled out his smartphone. He pressed the power button, praying for a flood of concerned messages from his wife. The screen lit up, but a harsh notification instantly popped up, blocking his access. The cellular service had been entirely disconnected. The Kensingtons had cut his line the second they realized their corporate accounts were frozen. Panic gripped his chest. He scrambled toward a rusted public payphone near the bus stop, feeding it the few loose coins he had in his wallet. He dialed Courtney's private number, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The automated voice of the carrier responded immediately, coldly informing him that the number he was trying to reach had actively blocked all incoming calls from his location. His wife had completely erased him. The sky above the city darkened rapidly, thick, bruised clouds rolling in from the west. A heavy, freezing rain began to fall, turning the concrete sidewalks into slick, treacherous paths. Devin had no money for a taxi, no active credit cards, and no transit pass. He pulled the collar of his ruined suit jacket up against the biting wind and began to walk. The journey was a brutal, agonizing, physical manifestation of his spectacular downfall. He walked for 5 grueling miles across the sprawling city, his expensive leather dress shoes soaking through his muscles, aching with exhaustion and hunger. The icy rain washed away the last lingering traces of the arrogant, entitled corporate executive who had stood in my living room demanding I fix his mistakes. With every step, the reality of his monumental hubris crushed down upon him. He had traded his loyal, hardworking father for a family of vipers who had discarded him the absolute second he lost his value. He had thrown away a lifetime of unconditional support for a shallow, materialistic illusion. As the streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows through the downpour, Devin finally turned onto my familiar, quiet street. He dragged his feet up the cracked concrete driveway, completely soaked to the bone, shivering violently. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps leading up to my porch. The warm yellow porch light was glowing steadily through the relentless rain. It was the absolute only beacon of safety he had left in the entire world. He stared at my heavy, locked wooden door, finally understanding the true, terrifying cost of his betrayal. He had arrived at the very house he had tried to steal, reduced to nothing more than a beggar in the storm. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked loudly, cutting through the rhythmic drumming of the freezing rain. I pushed the solid wooden door open and stepped out onto the covered porch. I had been monitoring the exterior security feeds for the last 20 minutes, tracking his slow, agonizing trudge down my dark street. I did not wear an expression of shock, pity, or paternal concern. I wore the same impenetrable, icy composure I had maintained since the night I walked out of the Waldorf Astoria. The warm yellow light from the overhead porch fixture spilled across the wet floorboards, illuminating the broken figure collapsed at the very bottom of the steps. Devin did not even try to stand. The moment the door swung open, his exhausted legs completely gave out beneath him. He dropped heavily to his knees, plunging directly into the cold, muddy grass bordering the concrete walkway. The freezing rain plastered his ruined designer suit to his shivering frame, entirely washing away the last remnants of the arrogant corporate executive who had tried to steal my life. He buried his face in his trembling hands, and a loud, gut-wrenching sob tore from his throat. The sound was agonizing, a raw, primal wail of a man who had completely destroyed his own universe and realized he had absolutely nowhere left to go. He stayed there on his knees in the mud, weeping uncontrollably, desperately waiting for his father to rush down the wooden stairs, lift him up from the dirt, and offer the unconditional forgiveness he had exploited for decades. I did not move a single muscle. I stood firmly on the dry planks of my porch, looking down at him with absolute clinical detachment. Devin slowly lifted his heavy head, the muddy water streaming down his face, mixing freely with his frantic tears. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and panicked, desperately, searching the shadows of the porch for the soft, compliant father he had walked all over for years. He crawled forward on his knees, dragging his ruined slacks through the wet dirt until he reached the bottom step. "Dad." He choked out his voice, a pathetic, ragged wheeze that barely cut through the sound of the rain. "Dad, you have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left. They took everything. They threw me away like a piece of garbage." He reached a shaking hand toward the wooden railing, treating it like a physical lifeline. He launched into a frantic, desperate monologue, utilizing every single emotional manipulation tactic he had learned from his wealthy, soulless in-laws. "It was not my fault, Dad," he cried, his voice rising in pitch as he desperately tried to shift the blame onto anyone else. "I was totally brainwashed by them. Courtney manipulated me into doing it. She threatened to leave me and ruin me if I did not get the money to save her parents. Pierce was breathing down my neck every single day. They completely poisoned my mind against you. I never actually wanted to put you in a home. I never wanted to take the house. They forced my hand. I am so deeply sorry. I see the truth now. I see how evil they really are." He sobbed louder, leaning his head against the wet wood of the bottom step, playing his absolute final card. "Mom would want us to fix this. You are the only family I have left in this entire world. Everyone else has completely abandoned me to rot. I know I made a colossal mistake, but I am your son. You are my father. We are blood. You have to forgive me. Please, Dad, let me come inside. Just let me dry off. I will do whatever you ask. I will work for you. I will earn back your trust. Just please do not leave me out here in the cold." I listened to his frantic, pathetic speech without interrupting a single word. I listened to a grown man utterly refuse to take an ounce of genuine accountability for his own actions. He did not apologize for forging my signature. He did not apologize for trying to have me locked inside a psychiatric ward. He only apologized because his wealthy safety net had evaporated, and he was completely terrified of facing the consequences of his own greed. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling in the mud, and I searched my heart one final time. I looked for the fiery rage that had driven me to systematically dismantle the Kensington Empire. I looked for the deep, agonizing heartbreak of a betrayed parent. I found absolutely neither. The anger had completely burned out, leaving behind a vast, empty void of total detachment. The emotional tether that had securely bound me to this boy for 32 years was permanently severed. I did not hate him, but I absolutely did not love him anymore. He was simply a stranger crying on my lawn. I reached behind the doorframe, picking up a heavy, faded green canvas duffel bag I had packed an hour earlier. I stepped forward to the edge of the porch and dropped the bag. It hit the wooden floorboards with a dull thud. Inside were the few old clothes, basic toiletries, and childhood mementos he had left in his old bedroom. Next to the duffel bag, I placed a plain white paper envelope. I extended my foot and slowly, deliberately slid the bag and the envelope across the wet wood until they stopped right at the edge of the top stair, directly in front of his face. "The envelope contains exactly $500 in cash," I stated, my voice echoing with a flat mechanical resonance. "It is enough for a bus ticket out of this city and a few nights in a cheap motel." Devin stared at the faded duffel bag and the white envelope as if they were venomous snakes. He looked back up at me, his mouth opening and closing in sheer, uncomprehending shock. He had fully expected fiery anger. He had expected a long moral lecture. He had never expected cold, permanent dismissal. "Dad, you cannot do this," he whimpered, a fresh wave of panic surging through his chest as the reality of his exile set in. "You cannot just pay me off and send me away. We are family." I looked directly into his terrified, desperate eyes, delivering the absolute final verdict. "Family does not forge signatures to steal the roof over their father's head," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the freezing rain. Family does not scheme to lock each other inside a psychiatric ward just to harvest their pension. You made your choice the night you watched security guards throw me onto the street. You chose the Kensingtons. Now you get to live with the exact life you built. Take the cash. Pick up the bag. Start over somewhere else entirely. Do not ever come back to this house. Devon reached out his shaking fingers, grazing the wet canvas of the duffel bag. He let out a long, agonizing wail, finally realizing that the bridge back to his father was entirely reduced to ash. I did not wait to watch him stand up. I turned my back on the stranger, shivering in the mud. I stepped back inside my quiet, warm house, pulled the heavy wooden door shut, and firmly engaged the brass deadbolt. The loud, metallic click echoed with absolute finality, permanently locking him out of my life. 6 months had passed since the heavy brass deadbolt of my front door clicked shut. The brutal, freezing rain of that night had long since given way to a bright, crisp spring morning. I was sitting at a small, polished oak table inside a quiet, upscale coffee shop nestled deep in the heart of the city's financial district. The air was rich with the scent of roasted espresso beans and fresh pastries. I was no longer wearing the faded canvas jacket that had served as my armor for so many years. I wore a tailored navy sport coat over a pristine, open-collared white shirt. The fabric was sharp, comfortable, and spoke of a quiet, undeniable authority. I had officially handed the day-to-day operations of the newly acquired Kensington assets over to Alejandro Vargas. He navigated the corporate bloodbath with surgical precision, liquidating the toxic properties and restructuring the viable ones to funnel directly into Camille's trust. I chose the quiet life of an invisible, highly lucrative shareholder. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, unfolding the morning newspaper. The chaotic, desperate noise of my former life had been completely erased. There were no frantic phone calls demanding bail money. There were no arrogant in-laws invading my private sanctuary. There was only the gentle hum of the espresso machine and the soft jazz playing through the ceiling speakers. I had successfully excised the cancer from my family tree. I turned the page of the newspaper, feeling a profound, settling peace anchor itself deep within my chest. I had fought a silent, brutal war against people who believed my kindness was a weakness, and I had emerged entirely victorious. I had secured my dignity, protected my late wife's brilliant legacy, and reclaimed the absolute ownership of my own existence. The brass bell mounted above the coffee shop door chimed a bright, cheerful note. I lowered my newspaper and looked toward the entrance. Victoria Thorne walked through the glass doors. She looked nothing like the frantic, terrified mother screaming in the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, nor did she resemble the ruthless corporate executioner who had dismantled the Kensington Empire in the boardroom. Today she looked radiant, completely relaxed, wearing a chic, understated beige trench coat and a warm, genuine smile. Holding tightly to her left hand was her 10-year-old daughter, Lily. The little girl who had been trapped upside down in a burning, mangled vehicle was completely miraculously recovered. There were no visible bandages, no lingering scars on her temple, and absolutely no trace of the violent trauma she had endured that night. She wore a bright yellow sundress, her eyes wide and full of vibrant, innocent energy. The moment Lily spotted me sitting at the corner table, she immediately let go of her mother's hand. She sprinted across the tiled floor of the cafe, her small shoes tapping a rapid, joyful rhythm. I barely had time to set my coffee mug down before she threw her arms around my waist, hugging me with a fierce, crushing strength. I stood up from my chair, wrapping my arms around her small shoulders, returning the embrace with a profound, genuine warmth. It was the exact type of pure, uncomplicated paternal affection I had spent decades trying to force upon a son who never truly wanted it. Victoria walked over her heels, clicking softly as she approached our table. She did not offer a stiff, formal handshake. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, her eyes shining with an immense, unspoken gratitude that transcended any financial alliance we had forged. She insisted on going to the counter to purchase my coffee, a small symbolic gesture of the deep, enduring bond we had formed in the fires of that chaotic night. We sat down together at the corner table, bathed in the morning sunlight streaming through the large glass windows, sharing a quiet, comfortable moment of absolute victory. As we sipped our drinks, Victoria casually leaned forward, stirring a packet of sugar into her latte. "The dust has completely settled on the bankruptcy proceedings," Victoria stated, her voice dropping to a calm, conversational volume. "I thought you might want a final update on the debris we left behind." I nodded slowly, maintaining a neutral, detached expression. Pierce Kensington managed to avoid federal prison by liquidating every single remaining asset to his name and pleading guilty to massive corporate fraud. The former real estate titan is currently working a brutal minimum-wage telemarketing job in a gray cubicle making cold calls just to cover his court-mandated restitution payments. Courtney was entirely blacklisted by her wealthy social circle the second the insolvency went public. Stripped of her trust fund and her stolen luxury vehicles, she was forced to move into her elderly grandmother's damp, unfinished basement. She spends her days aggressively blocking debt collectors on her prepaid cellular phone. And Devon Victoria continued taking a delicate sip of her drink. My private investigators have kept a very passive, distant eye on him just to ensure he honors your final directive. He fled the state exactly as instructed. He is currently working the graveyard shift bussing tables at a greasy roadside diner in rural Ohio. He spends his nights scraping congealed food off cheap porcelain plates for spare pocket change. I absorbed the final report on their miserable, self-inflicted fates without a single shred of pity, malice, or regret. I simply nodded my head. They had aggressively built their own cages, and now they were locked safely inside them. My smartphone was resting face up on the polished oak table. Suddenly, the screen lit up, accompanied by a soft, sharp vibration. I glanced down at the glowing glass. It was a text message originating from an unregistered, out-of-state area code. I read the short block of text illuminating the screen. "Dad, it is me. I got a cheap prepaid phone. I have been saving up my diner tips. I am truly trying to do better out here. Can we please talk?" I stared at the glowing words for a long, quiet moment. I did not feel the familiar heavy tug of parental guilt in my stomach. I did not wonder if the grueling labor of a roadside diner had actually reformed his corrupt, greedy soul. I did not care. I calmly reached out and picked up the device. With a steady, unwavering finger. I tapped the screen, opened the contact options menu, and firmly pressed the button to block the caller. I set the phone face down on the table, permanently silencing his voice. I picked up my ceramic mug, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my dark roast coffee, and smiled warmly at Lily as she excitedly began to tell me about her upcoming school science fair project. I leaned back in my chair, listening to her bright, happy voice. I had finally achieved total peace, complete freedom, and a brilliant legacy completely secured. Looking back on the ashes of their empire, I realized one final crucial lesson about power. The loudest people in the room are almost always the weakest. Pierce and his family needed to scream their worth to everyone they met because their foundation was built entirely on lies. I chose silence. I learned that true strength does not require an audience or a grand declaration. Sometimes the most devastating weapon you can wield against arrogant, toxic people is simply stepping back and allowing their own boundless greed to consume them. You do not always have to actively fight your enemies because if you remain patient enough, they will eventually destroy themselves. If my journey to peace and freedom resonated with you today, hit the subscribe button and tell me in the comments how you have successfully walked away from toxic people in your own life.